Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. You know that feeling of doing everything right, but something in the environment seems not to accept it. I can't explain it better, but that's what I felt that night. And to this day, I can't go back even near that building. I'm not telling this because I want attention or to make drama. I'm telling this because maybe someone needs to know that certain reactions aren't in the books, and that there are things the scalpel can't explain. It was my first shift alone at the medical examiner's office, interior of Montana, a town with about 50,000 inhabitants. The type of place where everyone knows each other and nobody asks too many questions. The medical examiner's office is in the back of the hospital, a low building, kind of isolated, with a constant smell of formaldehyde and old paper. Most of the older doctors said the ideal was to receive the body already in rigor mortis, because it moved less. I laughed at that. Nonsense from tired veterans. That Saturday night, a young man arrived under 30, victim of a violent attack. According to the chart, the injuries matched: deep hematomas on the face, jaw with exposed fracture, eyes with internal bleeding, trachea visibly crushed. It was as if someone had unleashed all the rage in the world on him. The body arrived around 2 in the morning. I was alone in the autopsy room. I locked the door as always. I organized the instruments, recorded everything calmly. I still had this idea that maintaining technical control made everything lighter. I started with external examinations. Up to that point, everything was normal. But when I went to begin opening the oral cavity, I needed to rest my hand on the head to position the metal retractor. It was at that moment that I felt pressure. The first thing I thought was that I had placed the spatula wrong, maybe at a bad angle that touched the palate, but no. The sensation was active. The teeth closed slightly over the metal as if the mouth had reacted pressed. I stopped, took out the spatula, looked, nothing. I breathed deeply, checked the body's rigidity, already well established. No sign of muscle relaxation. I replaced the retractor more carefully, this time fixing it more firmly to keep the mouth open. And again, the teeth slid and closed over the metal. A slow movement, but deliberate. And this time I felt the force. It wasn't a reflex, it was pressure. My first impulse was to rationalize, spasm, some type of residual involuntary contraction. I had read cases, but with advanced rigidity, and with so much force, I stepped away, took off the gloves, dried my sweaty face with the gown, forced myself to think. Follow protocol, don't trip out. But I was already tense. The environment seemed more closed, as if the air had thickened. I went back. I put the retractors again, this time using gauze between the teeth to avoid displacement. But then, while adjusting the head, I felt something touch. It was like a pinch on the tip of the glove, a firm touch, and when I looked there was a red line at the base of the thumb, as if I had been scratched. I took off the glove. It was a thin cut, shallow, but precise, the type of mark that only a lower canine could leave. And it was exactly where he had touched. My throat started to close. I was really alone. The nurse who did the intake had already returned to the hospital. The technician wasn't on shift, and I couldn't touch that face anymore. I bandaged my hand, put a folded gauze between the body's teeth, and wrapped it with more gauze, securing it with tape, locked. Immobile. I left the room, went to get air outside near the patio gate, where I could see a bit of the street. I stayed there about 15 minutes trying to convince myself that I had exaggerated, that it was just nervousness from the first night alone. But when I returned, the body was on its side, partially thrown off the gurney, the head turned toward me, the loose tape fallen on the floor and the gauze. The gauze I had stuffed in the mouth was spit out beside the foot of the stainless steel table. I froze at the door. The sound of the air conditioning was the only living thing in that place. There was no wind, no movement from me. The door was locked. No one had entered. The room's camera had been broken since the previous week. It was even on the technical meeting agenda. And I confirmed that later. But at that moment, nothing made sense. I secured the body, left it stable, went out, came back, and it reacted. I went back to the room as if I was crossing a minefield. I didn't look directly at the eyes. They were already opaque, but at that moment they seemed to look back. I took the chart, noted only what was indispensable, and left. I didn't complete the report, didn't follow protocol, just registered the essential to release the body. The rest I didn't even want to touch. I left before the shift ended. I never went back to the medical examiner's office. Days later, I received a message from the technician responsible for the sector. He just wrote, "That body. Did you see the same thing the resident saw in 2014? He also said the mouth still tried to bite." When I read that message from the technician, my whole body froze. I was already home for 2 days, trying to forget, trying to pretend it had been in my head, that I was tired, tense, inexperienced. But that phrase, the same thing the resident saw in 2014, it changed everything. It wasn't just with me, it was an impression. That had happened before. I sat on the couch with the phone in my hand for more than half an hour. I didn't respond or call, and I didn't even want to know more details, to be honest, because if I knew, I wouldn't be able to sleep ever again. The following week, I requested leave. I said I needed time for personal matters. The coordination staff didn't even question it. Maybe they were already used to this type of thing. They just never said anything, which only makes everything even worse. And then, unintentionally, talking to an older doctor who had already worked at that medical examiner's office, she mentioned a strange case years ago. She said a resident from the capital, who spent a month there during mandatory internship, left in the middle of the shift, disappeared for 3 days, was found in a hotel in the neighboring city, locked in the room, without cell phone, without talking to anyone. Left medical school right after. At the time they said it was study fatigue, but after what I saw, I know it wasn't just that. What's in that building isn't supernatural in the way we hear in movies. There's no apparition, no scream, there's physical reaction, measured in centimeters and grams. There's contact, and the worst, there's intention, because what I felt in that room wasn't random. The mouth responded. Not once, but twice. And when I secured it, it spit out. Do you have any idea what that is? It's not fear of what you see, it's fear of what you feel, of what the hand touches and shouldn't touch, of what the body returns when it was supposed to be in silence. The cut on my finger disappeared in 2 days, but I still see it sometimes when I'm washing my hands, as if the skin remembered more than I wanted. The worst part is that I reopened my internship notebook. I wrote everything down that night, in the interval between the body's arrival and the moment it turned. There it was written: jaw, left lateral fracture, lower teeth intact. Subjective impression of pressure during oral manipulation, metal spatula displaced, repetition of movement twice. Possible residual contraction. But that possible no longer serves, because it wasn't spasm, it wasn't involuntary contraction. And whoever never went through this won't believe. But whoever went through it knows that there are things in that place that respond to touch, that don't accept being examined, that are still there somehow. What holds me to this day from going completely crazy is knowing that at least I left, that I didn't ignore what my body felt. There are people who say the worst is seeing ghosts, but I think the worst is when what you're sure is dead still tries to bite. And not just once, but until you leave. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Ethan, and I've always been someone who finds genuine peace and restoration in the solitude that only the mountains can provide. I live in Denver, working in the tech industry like so many others. But whenever I can manage to get away, I escape to a small retreat I own in the Colorado Rockies. A rustic cabin I inherited from an old family friend who had been like a second father to me throughout my childhood. The place has its own unique charm and character, despite the fact that on more than one occasion it has struck me as somewhat isolated, and, if I'm being completely honest, occasionally unsettling in ways I struggle to articulate. However, what happened during that particular rainy afternoon in late September changed my entire perspective on the world and my place in it. That weekend, I didn't just experience fear in its purest form. I discovered that nature itself seems to harbor secrets that we humans were never meant to uncover or understand. The cabin sits nestled in a valley about 2.5 hours' drive from the city, completely surrounded by a dense forest of towering ponderosa pines, Douglas firs, and ancient aspens that turn brilliant gold each autumn. There's no cell phone service, no internet connection, and no landline, which makes it absolutely perfect for disconnecting from the constant stress and digital noise of modern urban life. To reach the cabin, you have to navigate a winding dirt road that becomes treacherous and nearly impassable when it rains heavily, transforming into a muddy nightmare that can trap even the most experienced mountain drivers. But that particular weekend, despite weather forecasts predicting severe thunderstorms and flash flood warnings throughout the central Rockies, I decided to make the journey anyway. Perhaps it was because I thought it would be an ideal opportunity to experience the raw power of a mountain storm from the safety and comfort of my sanctuary. Or maybe I was simply desperate enough for solitude that I was willing to risk getting stranded. The drive up to the cabin proved to be more challenging than I had anticipated. Dark clouds gathered ominously over the peaks like an army preparing for battle. And by the time I finally reached my destination, pulling into the small clearing where I always parked, the rain had begun to fall with increasing intensity and violence. The sound of raindrops hammering against the cabin's metal roof was initially relaxing and hypnotic, creating the kind of white noise that usually helped me unwind and forget about deadlines and client demands. But there was something different about the atmosphere that afternoon. something that set my nerves on edge in a way I couldn't quite identify or explain. The cold breeze that whistled through the gaps around the windows carried with it an unusual chill that seemed to penetrate straight through to my bones. The creaking and groaning of tree branches in the surrounding forest, which I had always found comforting in the past, now seemed to have taken on a more sinister and threatening tone. I didn't pay much attention to these subtle changes at first, dismissing them as products of my imagination or the result of stress from a particularly demanding work week. I built a crackling fire in the stone fireplace, arranged myself comfortably in my favorite leather armchair with a well-worn paperback novel, and settled in to enjoy what I expected would be a peaceful and restorative evening. The first few hours passed tranquilly enough. The rain maintained its steady rhythm against the windows like nature's own percussion section, and the cheerful crackling and popping of burning pine logs was the only sound that broke the profound silence of the mountain wilderness. However, after a while, I began to notice something that definitely didn't belong. A soft but persistent tapping sound coming from somewhere near the back door of the cabin. At first, I assumed it might be a loose tree branch scraping against the wooden siding due to the wind, or perhaps a raccoon or other curious woodland creature. Investigating the unusual sounds and smells coming from my temporary human presence in their domain. But the sound continued with an almost rhythmic quality, deliberate and purposeful, as if someone or something was gently but insistently knocking on the weathered wood. I got up to investigate, making my way through the cabin's small but efficiently designed interior. But when I reached the back door and peered through the rain-streaked window, I saw nothing except the familiar darkness of the forest, now made even more impenetrable by the heavy rainfall and the complete absence of moonlight filtering through the storm clouds. I stared out into the black void for several long minutes, straining my eyes to detect any movement or unusual shapes among the trees. But I could see nothing beyond the silver curtain of rain that seemed to separate my small island of warmth and light from the vast, unknowable wilderness that surrounded it. Somewhat confused, but not yet truly alarmed, I returned to the main room and tried to settle back into my reading routine. I convinced myself that my mind was simply playing tricks on me, that the isolation and the dramatic weather were combining to create false perceptions and imaginary threats where none actually existed. However, something deep in my subconscious refused to let me relax completely. That persistent feeling of being watched began to creep over me like a slow-moving fog, starting as a barely noticeable sensation and gradually growing stronger and more insistent with each passing minute. I found myself glancing repeatedly toward the windows, scanning the darkness beyond the glass, but I could never quite shake the impression that something out there was returning my gaze with equal intensity. The sensation grew more pronounced as the storm continued to rage, and what had started as mild unease began to transform into something approaching genuine fear. The feeling persisted and intensified throughout the evening, growing stronger rather than fading as logic suggested it should. At first, I told myself it was nothing more than the natural sounds of a mountain storm, or perhaps the cabin itself, settling and creaking under the assault of wind and rain as old wooden structures often do. But as the rain grew heavier and the wind more violent, I began to hear something else entirely. something that made my blood run cold and sent icy shivers down my spine. They were footsteps, light and cautious, but unmistakably real, as if someone was moving around the exterior of the cabin with deliberate stealth, taking great care not to make too much noise while conducting some kind of surveillance or reconnaissance. I shot to my feet, my heart suddenly pounding like a bass drum in my chest. Who could possibly be out in the middle of such a fierce storm, in this remote location that was miles from the nearest neighbor or main road? What kind of person would be wandering around in these mountains during weather that was dangerous, even for experienced hikers and outdoorsmen? I moved cautiously toward the window that faced the main room and tried to peer out into the storm-lashed darkness. But the rain was falling so heavily now that it was impossible to see anything clearly. The world beyond my windows had become a wall of water and shadow that could have been hiding anything or anyone. I decided I had to investigate, despite every instinct screaming at me to stay inside where it was safe and warm. I grabbed my most powerful flashlight from the kitchen drawer and opened the front door cautiously, preparing myself for the shock of cold mountain air and driving rain. The storm hit me like a physical blow as I stepped outside. The rain was so intense it felt like standing under a waterfall, and the cold mountain air cut through my clothes and chilled me to the bone within seconds. I swept the flashlight beam in wide arcs around the immediate area, searching for any sign of movement or disturbance. But I could see nothing except rain, darkness, and the vague outlines of familiar trees swaying violently in the wind. I returned to the cabin feeling more unsettled than ever, with water dripping from my hair and clothes, but no answers to explain what I had heard. I locked the door securely behind me and tried to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing, that stress and isolation had combined to create auditory hallucinations where none existed. But the feeling of being watched refused to disappear. It was as if every corner of the cabin was filled with invisible eyes, watching and waiting for me to make some crucial mistake or let down my guard. The storm continued its relentless assault outside, and I found myself becoming increasingly paranoid and jumpy with each passing hour. When I finally attempted to sleep, the sensation of being observed became almost overwhelming. I lay in my bed, listening to the wind howling around the cabin like a living thing. But beneath that natural sound, I could swear I heard something else. A faint breathing sound, as if someone was standing just outside my bedroom window, watching and waiting in the darkness. I opened my eyes repeatedly throughout the night, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement or intrusion, but I could never see anything definitive. Still, the feeling persisted, growing stronger each time I closed my eyes, until I was convinced that something or someone was indeed out there in the storm, circling my cabin like a predator stalking its prey. I didn't sleep at all that night. When dawn finally broke through the storm clouds, gray and watery, but infinitely welcome, I got up immediately with a determination to investigate the area around the cabin more thoroughly. Something told me this wasn't just my imagination running wild, and I needed to find concrete evidence one way or the other. As I stepped outside into the post-storm morning, I could immediately see fresh tracks in the mud that surrounded my cabin. They were small and somewhat indistinct, made by someone who had been walking carefully and deliberately around the perimeter of my property. always staying within the shadow of the tree line, where they would be difficult to spot from inside. I followed the muddy tracks with growing unease, trying to maintain my composure while my heart rate steadily increased. The prints led me in a rough circle around the entire cabin, indicating that whoever had made them had spent considerable time studying my temporary home from every possible angle. The tracks were recent, made sometime during the storm, which meant the person had been out there in the worst of the weather, getting soaked and battered by rain and wind while they conducted their mysterious surveillance. Eventually, the trail led me deeper into the forest, winding between the massive tree trunks toward a small clearing I had discovered during previous visits. There, in the center of the open space, I found something that made my blood freeze in my veins. An old camping chair, the kind you might take on a hunting or fishing trip, positioned to provide a clear view of my cabin through the trees. The chair was still damp from the rain, and the ground around it showed signs of recent use, with cigarette butts and food wrappers scattered nearby. Someone had been using this location as a watching post, observing my cabin and my activities from a distance. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. When I examined the chair more closely, I found a small pair of binoculars hanging from one of the armrests, and tucked beneath the seat was a notebook wrapped in plastic to protect it from the rain. My hands trembled as I opened the notebook and began to read. The pages contained detailed observations about my routine, my schedule, my habits. Someone had been watching me for weeks, maybe months, documenting when I arrived, how long I stayed, what I did during my visits to the mountains. The handwriting was small and precise, and the level of detail was absolutely chilling. This person knew things about me that even my closest friends didn't know, personal quirks, and behaviors that I thought no one had ever noticed or cared about. The final entry in the notebook was dated just 2 days before my current visit, and it contained information that should have been impossible for anyone to know. My exact travel plans, the route I would take to reach the cabin, and even a rough estimate of when I would arrive. I ran back to the cabin as fast as my legs could carry me, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I locked every door and window, checked every possible entry point, and spent the rest of the morning packing my belongings with shaking hands. I couldn't stay there another moment, couldn't risk another night in a place where I was clearly being stalked by someone with unknown intentions. As I loaded my car and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched from somewhere in the surrounding forest. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide a potential threat. Every rustle of leaves in the wind made me jump and spin around, searching for signs of my mysterious observer. I never discovered who had been watching me or what they wanted. The police investigation that followed turned up no leads, no suspects, no explanation for the elaborate surveillance operation that had been conducted from the woods around my property. The notebook disappeared from evidence within a week, and the investigating officers seemed strangely reluctant to pursue the case with any real vigor. I never spent another night alone at that cabin, and eventually I sold the property to a developer who planned to tear down the old structure and build something more modern and secure. But sometimes, even now, when I'm alone in my Denver apartment during a thunderstorm, I find myself checking the locks on my doors and windows, wondering if somewhere out there in the darkness, someone is still watching and waiting. documenting my every move with the same obsessive attention to detail I discovered in that rain-soaked notebook. The mountains of Colorado still call to me, but I've learned that not all of their secrets are benign, and not everything that watches us from the wilderness has our best interests at heart. There are things that come back only when you're too quiet. For me, it's when I'm on a bus and I look at that seat there by the door, the emergency seat. It's not that I remember because I want to, it's that my body remembers for me. My stomach turns, my chest gets heavy, I get cold. Because it was there, exactly there, that everything began. This was a few years ago. It was a normal bus trip, one of those long interstate ones. I was heading home after visiting my parents. I caught the night bus, that stuffy heat, dim light inside the vehicle, and everyone just wanting to reach their destination. I sat more toward the middle. I like being near the window. There was nobody in front of me. Behind me, a couple was arguing quietly. Typical. A little past halfway through the trip, when there were already people sleeping, a woman got on at a roadside rest stop. She entered with a plastic bag in her hand and her shirt tied around her waist, but what caught my attention was her face. Pale, sweating. It gave me the impression that she wasn't well. But we always think it's not our business, right? She looked at the driver and said something quietly, pointing to the seat by the door. The driver nodded as if to say, "Sit right there." And she sat. I remember looking at her for a few seconds. You could see her heavy breathing, like someone trying to control discomfort. Her head kept dropping. Sometimes you could see she wasn't traveling for pleasure. Then the bus got back on the road. In the silence of the early morning, you could only hear the engine noise, some scattered coughs, and the air conditioning crackling. But it wasn't long before the driver stopped again on the shoulder. That's when everyone started waking up. People lifting their necks, looking around. The woman in front asked loudly, "Are we already at some city?" And the driver answered from his seat without turning around, "Technical stop. A passenger is feeling sick. I already called the paramedics. I'll wait here a bit." I just looked to the side and saw the woman there, still sweating, now with her head against the window. She wasn't complaining, wasn't asking for anything, just trying to endure it. About 3 minutes later came the first annoyance. An older man, business clothes, gold glasses hanging from his nose. He got up with an audible sigh, like someone who can't stand waiting anymore. He went to her, stood there looking. The woman noticed, slowly raised her face, kind of confused. And then he said something that still doesn't sit right with me. "Miss, that seat is mine. I paid for the premium." Dry, without even asking how she was. She stayed for a few seconds just staring, maybe waiting for someone to intervene, maybe waiting for common sense to speak louder. But it didn't speak, not in him, not in anyone, not in me. She forced herself with her hands on her knees, got up kind of wobbly, like someone who just got up from bed after a fever, and went down the steps, not to get off, but to sit right there on the floor by the door. Yes, she stayed there, sitting on the steps with her head down, the bag in her lap. The man sat down and pulled the seatbelt with a snap. The entire scene didn't last even 2 minutes, but I swear it felt like time had stretched. I still remember the sound of the seat hinges when he settled in, and the way she stayed there, like someone who was accepting. Or maybe didn't even have the strength to question anything anymore. About 10 minutes passed. Bus there stopped on the shoulder, No paramedics. The woman seemed worse. Her head was now resting on her knee. Every minute that passed, the discomfort inside the bus grew, not with her, but with the weight. A guy in the back asked loudly if we couldn't just keep going. Another woman said, "If she's so sick, let her get off. We have schedules." The driver, pressured, said he would drive to the next rest area and try calling the paramedics again from there. And the bus started moving again. The woman continued sitting on the stairs, but now with the vehicle in motion, she held the bag with one hand. The other held onto the metal rail by the door. I remember thinking, it's not safe, someone should say something. But nobody said anything, not me either, and that's when it happened. I'll never forget. An animal crossed the road. The driver braked hard, throwing everyone forward. The woman slipped. It all happened very fast. The movement, the sound of the door slamming, the dull thud, someone's muffled scream from the back. She fell from the moving bus. I got up instinctively, looked out the side window, and what I saw destroyed me. She was lying on the ground, legs turned the wrong way, the bag torn, things scattered on the road, and blood. A lot of blood. The bus stopped, the driver ran out, but so did two passengers. Not me. I froze. Inside the bus, nobody spoke. A woman started crying quietly. The man from the premium seat just lowered his head. The rest was waiting. Police came, ambulance came, company came. The woman was already dead, and nobody disputed that. Nobody pointed fingers. Nobody yelled at anyone. There was just a strange emptiness, a complicit silence. We stayed there, stopped on the shoulder while the woman no longer breathed. I remember that nobody wanted to look directly. One or two got off but came back quickly. Most just stayed seated, in silence. The man who had demanded the seat, he didn't get up, didn't go see anything. He stayed there with his hands clasped in his lap, staring at nothing. I paid attention to him. For some reason, I couldn't stop looking. That type of man who speaks well, who thinks he's right about everything. But at that moment, he seemed like an empty body, a machine turned off. Another bus from the same company came to take the passengers to the final destination. We changed vehicles in silence. I sat further back this time and kept looking at the movement outside the window, trying to understand what had just happened. But you can't understand, right? Because that wasn't just an accident. It was a sequence of omissions, a death divided into pieces among each of us. The driver who didn't impose authority, the passengers who complained about the delay, the man who chose comfort, and me, who stayed quiet. It's easy to put it all on his shoulders, right? To say it was the fault of the selfish old man with the paid seat. But the truth is I was there, I saw, I understood what was happening, and I did nothing. And that corrodes me. Arriving at the destination, people got off as if they had taken a normal trip. Some commented quietly, others avoided looking at each other. I waited for everyone to leave before getting off. When I went to hand my ticket to the new bus driver, he looked at me with a tired expression. He just said, "Good night," and I replied, "Good night too," as if nothing had happened. I got home, left my backpack on the floor, and went straight to the bathroom. I looked at my face in the mirror and realized I looked like a different person. That night, I couldn't sleep. I closed my eyes and saw the exact moment she slipped. The sound of the door, the body falling, the sound the body made when it hit the ground. A dry, horrible, real sound. In the following days, I tried to find news on websites. I only found a small note. Woman dies after falling from moving bus. Nothing about the cause, nothing about what preceded it. No name mentioned, no mention of the old man who took her place, nothing. She became a statistic, and what did we become? I never saw that man again, don't even know his name. But sometimes I wonder if he thinks about it too, if his silence from that trip is the same one that weighs on my chest to this day. Time passed, and to this day when I take a bus, especially at night, I avoid looking at that seat. But it's inevitable, because it's always there, empty or occupied. That seat still carries her body. Once I sat in it without realizing. I was distracted, tired. When I noticed, my hands were sweating, my stomach was churning. I got up for no reason, sat in another seat, and kept looking at the chair as if it would explode. Maybe deep down I wanted it to explode, to scream, to throw in everyone's face what happened. But it just stays there, quiet, clean, silent, just like we stayed. Today I'm telling this because I can't keep it in anymore. Not that it will change anything, right? But maybe someone will listen. And if one day you see someone being pushed out of a place because of paid comfort, maybe you'll have the courage to speak up, something I didn't have. I'm not a hero or a villain. I was just another one who saw everything and chose silence. And that's what hurts me to this day. My name is Sam, and if you ask me why I'm telling you this story, the answer is simple. No matter how hard I try, I cannot forget it. Although months have passed since that day, I still find myself walking through the same neighborhoods of San Francisco, searching for answers that never come and may never exist. Sometimes I wonder if the whole experience was simply an illusion, a fragmentation of my mind during a moment of exhaustion and urban loneliness that had been building up for weeks. But on the other hand, there's something deep inside me that insists what I experienced that foggy afternoon was real. More real than anything else I've ever encountered in my 32 years of life in this city by the bay. It was one of those quintessentially San Francisco days when the sky seems perpetually on the verge of collapse, when the marine layer rolls in from the Pacific like a living thing and swallows entire neighborhoods in its gray embrace. I had been working in my downtown office since early morning, but the atmosphere was so heavy and oppressive, so thick with the kind of fog that makes breathing feel like work, that I found it impossible to concentrate on spreadsheets and client reports. Around 3 in the afternoon, when the fog had become so dense that the windows of my 20th floor office were completely obscured, I made an impulsive decision that would change everything. I closed my laptop, locked my office door behind me, and ventured out into the mist-shrouded streets of the financial district. The city, which normally thrums with constant energy and movement, seemed muted and subdued, as if the fog had absorbed not just light and sound, but the very life force that usually animated its crowded sidewalks and bustling intersections. There was hardly any traffic moving through the streets, and the few pedestrians I encountered seemed to move with unusual haste, as if they didn't want to linger in this transformed version of their familiar city. The sound of foghorns echoed from the bay like the voices of lost souls, and the wet pavement reflected the amber glow of streetlights that had automatically activated in response to the premature darkness. Everything was covered in a fine mist that made the most ordinary buildings and landmarks appear mysterious and otherworldly. I walked without any particular destination in mind, allowing myself to be guided by the rhythm of my footsteps on the damp concrete. And the hypnotic way the fog swirled around the familiar landmarks that were now rendered strange and unfamiliar. The city felt too quiet, too empty, as if I was moving through a place that existed parallel to the San Francisco I knew, a shadow version where different rules applied. I found myself drifting away from the tourist areas and business districts. Crossing streets I rarely traveled and exploring neighborhoods that were usually just names on maps to me. The sidewalks were nearly deserted, and the facades of Victorian houses and converted warehouses, shrouded in thick fog and dampened by the constant moisture in the air, gave me the eerie sensation that I was walking through a city where time had stopped moving forward decades ago. As I turned a corner near the intersection of two streets whose names I didn't recognize, the fog began to descend even more dramatically, thickening with each step I took, until visibility was reduced to just a few feet in any direction. It was at that moment when I realized I no longer recognized the area where I found myself. I wasn't lost in the traditional sense. I still had a general idea of which direction would take me back to familiar territory. But I simply couldn't remember ever having been in this particular part of the city before. And yet, there was something about the dampness in the air, something about the way the fog moved between the buildings, that felt incredibly familiar, as if I was returning to a place I had known in childhood dreams. That's when I saw the bookstore materializing from the mist like something conjured by the fog itself. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light and shadow, an optical illusion created by the interplay of street lamps and swirling gray air. It was a small, narrow shop wedged between two larger buildings that seemed to have forgotten it existed, with a hand-painted wooden sign that, despite the moisture and poor visibility, appeared to be completely undamaged by weather or time. The only text I could make out clearly through the fog was the name, written in elegant script, Whispers and Wonders Books. Something about that name made me stop in my tracks, though I couldn't explain why. The bookstore wasn't marked on any map of San Francisco I had ever seen, wasn't listed in any directory or guidebook, and yet it seemed to belong there as naturally as if it had been part of the neighborhood for a century. The store appeared to have materialized from nowhere, as if it had always been there waiting to be discovered by the right person at exactly the right moment. I approached the entrance with growing curiosity mixed with an inexplicable sense of apprehension. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see warm light spilling out into the fog like honey. Inside, the illumination was soft and golden, barely bright enough to reveal the tall shelves packed with books that seemed to stretch up into shadows where the ceiling should have been. Some of the volumes had spines so worn and faded that their titles had become completely illegible, while others looked as if they had just been printed and bound that very morning. The wooden floor creaked with each step I took, producing sounds that seemed to echo longer than they should have in such a small space. The air was filled with that distinctive aroma that every book lover recognizes instantly, that intoxicating mixture of aged paper, leather bindings, and the faint mustiness that speaks of stories waiting to be discovered. At first, I felt uncomfortable, as if someone was observing me from the spaces between the shelves, but I quickly dismissed the feeling as a natural response to being alone in an unfamiliar place. There was no one else visible in the store, no clerk or owner that I could see. Just me and thousands of books that seemed to watch me with the patient attention of old friends. As I explored the narrow aisles, something remarkable began to happen. I started recognizing books I hadn't seen in years, volumes I thought no longer existed anywhere in the world. There were rare first editions of novels I remembered from my grandfather's personal library. Books he had shared with me during long summer afternoons when I was a child learning to love literature. I found a complete collection of mystery novels that my grandmother had cherished. Stories she used to read aloud to me before bedtime when my parents were traveling for work. There was even one of those impossibly rare illustrated editions of Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes that my grandfather had owned, and that had disappeared sometime after his death, when the family was sorting through his belongings. But as extraordinary as these discoveries were, I couldn't remember ever having seen this bookstore before in all my years of living in San Francisco. The sensation of déjà vu was overwhelming, as if I was rediscovering a place that had been erased from my memory, but preserved in my dreams. I approached a particular shelf that had captured my attention, one that was filled with books I couldn't identify, but that somehow seemed to call out to me personally. The titles were unfamiliar, yet I felt drawn to them in a way I couldn't rationally explain. On this same shelf, there was one volume that seemed to pulse with its own inner light, demanding my attention above all the others. The Man Who Forgot His Own Story. I had no idea why, but I felt compelled to take it from the shelf, as if it had been placed there specifically for me to find. I pulled the book carefully from its place and opened it with trembling hands. The pages were yellowed with age, as if the book had been stored for decades in some forgotten corner of a library that existed outside of normal time. The text was printed in an old-fashioned typeface that reminded me of books from the early 20th century. But what truly unsettled me was the overwhelming sense of familiarity that washed over me as I read the opening paragraph. It was as if I had read these exact words before, as if the sentences were already engraved somewhere deep in my memory, waiting to be rediscovered. The story seemed to be about a man who woke up one day to discover that he couldn't remember his own past, that his entire life history had been erased overnight, leaving him to reconstruct his identity from fragments and clues left behind by the person he used to be. Suddenly, a voice interrupted my reading, soft and melodious, but clear enough to cut through my concentration like a blade through silk. I turned toward the source of the sound and saw an elderly woman standing near the entrance to the store. I hadn't heard her enter, hadn't detected any movement or footsteps, and had no idea how long she might have been watching me. She had silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon that suggested refinement and old-world grace, and her penetrating gaze made me feel as if I was being carefully evaluated according to criteria I couldn't begin to understand. Despite her advanced age, her posture was straight and dignified, almost regal, and she wore a flowing skirt made of heavy fabric and a cotton blouse that appeared to have been crafted by hand rather than mass-produced. "Do you like what you're discovering?" she asked with a smile that wasn't exactly unfriendly, but wasn't entirely welcoming either. There was something enigmatic about her expression that made me feel as if she knew far more about me and my presence in her store than she was letting on. I didn't know how to respond to her question. The bookstore, with its impossibly familiar yet completely unknown atmosphere, had confused and disoriented me to the point where I wasn't sure if I was awake or dreaming, if this was reality or some elaborate fantasy my mind had constructed. "Yes, it's just that I didn't know this place existed," I replied, hearing my own voice sound more nervous and uncertain than I had intended. "I've lived in San Francisco for most of my life, and I've never seen this bookstore before. I had no idea it was here." The woman observed me in silence for what felt like an eternity, as if she was weighing every word I had spoken and considering how much truth she was willing to share in return. Then, with a calm that seemed to come from some deep well of ancient wisdom, she said something that sent chills down my entire spine. "Sometimes places don't need to be known in order to exist. They simply wait in the spaces between what people think they understand about the world, hoping that eventually someone with the right kind of sight will come along and find them. And you, young man, have you come here searching for something specific? Or are you just wandering through the fog hoping to stumble upon whatever it is you've lost?" Her words left me speechless and deeply unsettled. Searching for something. What could she possibly mean? I had no conscious awareness of looking for anything beyond shelter from the fog, and perhaps an interesting book to pass the time. I didn't understand what she was trying to tell me, but there was something in her manner, something in the way she looked at me, that made me profoundly uncomfortable. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of the situation, scanning the shelves filled with books that shouldn't have existed, standing in a store that had no logical explanation for being there. Finally, I carefully placed the mysterious book back on the shelf where I had found it and politely thanked her for her time, though I wasn't entirely sure what had just transpired between us. I had no idea whether I was in a real bookstore having a genuine conversation with an actual person, or if I was experiencing some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the disorienting effects of the fog that had transformed the city into an alien landscape. I said goodbye to the elderly woman, though she made no verbal response to my farewell, and walked toward the door with legs that felt unsteady beneath me. As I reached for the handle, I heard her voice one final time, speaking so quietly that I had to strain to understand her words. "Remember, Sam," she said, and the fact that she knew my name when I was certain I had never told her made my heart skip several beats. Some stories choose their readers rather than the other way around. If you ever find yourself truly lost, if you ever need to remember who you really are, you'll know how to find your way back here. I stepped out of the bookstore and back into the swirling fog, feeling the familiar dampness of San Francisco air on my face like a reminder that I was still connected to the physical world. But when I turned around to look back at the store, to fix its location in my memory so I could return when I was feeling more rational and prepared, I found that it was no longer there. The space where the bookstore had been was now occupied by a blank wall covered in graffiti and weathered posters, advertising concerts and events from months or even years ago. There were no signs that a bookstore had ever existed in that location. No traces of the warm light that had drawn me inside. No evidence of the conversation I had just had with the mysterious woman who somehow knew my name. I stood there in the fog for several minutes, staring at the empty wall and trying to convince myself that I had simply become confused about the location, that the store was actually around the corner or down the block. But no matter how carefully I searched the surrounding streets, I could find no trace of Whispers and Wonders books, or any indication that it had ever been part of this neighborhood. That night I couldn't sleep. The book I had held, the words I had read, the conversation with the woman who knew things about me she shouldn't have known, everything continued to circle through my mind like a record player stuck on the same track. Maybe I would never know what had actually happened during those lost hours in the fog, whether the bookstore had been real or imagined. But what I did know with absolute certainty was that something fundamental had changed inside me. The city I thought I knew completely had revealed itself to be full of hidden layers and secret spaces that existed just beyond the edge of normal perception. And every time I walk through the foggy streets of San Francisco now, I find myself searching, even though I know that no matter how hard I look, that mysterious bookstore will never be there when I expect it. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick from the Pacific and transforms the familiar city into something strange and unknowable, I catch a faint whiff of old books and aging paper carried on the wind, and I remember the woman's final words about stories that choose their own readers. And on those nights, I wonder if perhaps the bookstore is still out there somewhere, waiting patiently in the mist for the next lost soul who needs to remember something important about themselves that they didn't even know they had forgotten. I started to suspect something was wrong when the workstation at Station 2 turned on by itself, with no one logged in and a new scan in processing. It was just after 2 in the morning. Here at the hospital, the imaging department is in the basement. It's not poetic, it's just poorly planned. It's isolated from the emergency room with elevator access and a technical staircase. At night, it's just me, a security guard in the hallway, and no one else. If I need to call someone from nursing, it takes time. From the surgical center, forget about it. The silence down here has weight. The monitor light casts shadows on the wall. It's so dark. I work with imaging for 16 years. When I started, the systems still choked. The PACS crashed constantly. I had to call to ask for order confirmation. I wrote things on paper. Today, everything is automatic. Orders come in via internal system, linked to the bed, to the doctor, and already uploaded with the scan protocol. I just prepare, scan, and send back to the chart. That night, an order came in for abdominal CT with contrast, name, bed, admission number, everything normal. It was a 52-year-old patient, according to the order, admitted with abdominal pain and history of gastrointestinal surgery. The name sounded familiar, but I didn't pay attention. There are names that come back. It's common, and I never memorized files. It's not my job. I prepared the room, adjusted the parameters. When I went to get the patient from the indicated bed 302A, he was already on the gurney, ready, sleeping, maybe sedated. Nothing abnormal if coming directly from nursing with contrast protocol. I did the complete scan. He didn't say anything, didn't move. It wasn't the first quiet patient I had attended. Quick scanning, 3 passes, everything clean, precise, no noise, no artifact. When I finished, I left the patient on the recovery room gurney and went to export the images. That's when what I still can't explain began. The file had disappeared. The order was no longer in the system queue. I hit F5, restarted the console. Nothing. The search by name didn't return any admitted patient, not in the clinical ward, not in the surgical ward. I opened the electronic chart externally manually. Result, patient not found. I went back to the empty gurney. I thought they took him back with some aid, but no one passes by me without me seeing. The access has a camera, and I can hear the doors opening from my station, and they're nothing. I took a deep breath, sat down, and for the first time in a long time I felt my hands shaking, not from fear, but from error. And error for me is almost sin. Radiology is exact. If there's a wrong pixel, someone gets hurt. I opened the external hard drive. I have this habit, an old routine I kept. I save a local copy of scans before sending to PACS. It's a form of security, something from someone who saw too many systems fail. I opened the DICOM file, entered the image metadata, and there I froze. The image showed marks of old ribs, fractured and calcified. 3 well-closed surgical cuts with metallic marks, and a blade was visible there in the abdomen, as if someone had forgotten an object inside the body. But the acquisition date of the scan wasn't that night. It was 9 years ago. Same name, same hospital, same type of scan, same pattern of scars, same metallic object. The system accused that it had been scanned in 2015. And still, I saw the scan happen. I did it with my own eyes there that night. And at this point, I still thought I was facing a bizarre failure, a file error, a poorly referenced old backup, until I searched the central system and discovered that that man had not only been treated there at the hospital in 2015, but had also died here. It was after complications from an unsuccessful abdominal surgery. The record from the time said he stayed almost a month admitted, was operated twice, and ended up not resisting the second surgery. The metallic object that appeared in the images had been precisely the error, a small instrument left inside the abdomen, which caused generalized inflammation. And that's what took his life. His name was Michael, and everything matched. The age, the history, even the bed number used at the time. 302A. I turned off the monitor, but kept looking at the black screen as if it were going to continue telling. It wasn't just a bug, it was a sequence of data that didn't lie. The CT date was there. The file had been saved by me. The scan had been done that night. The contrast was consumed. The equipment detected body presence. The software doesn't make that mistake. And still, the patient no longer existed, not before, not now. In an attempt to calm myself, I called IT support. I explained only the technical part, that a scan had entered the system and disappeared, and that I wanted to know if PACS was unstable. The technician on the other side, who was also on shift, asked for the order code. I didn't have it anymore. I gave the time and the station. He searched for 15 minutes. Answer: there was no scan in that interval, no order made by any doctor, 0 protocol generated, no movement in 302A in the last 48 hours. That gurney where I had left the patient was in the system as free for use. I hung up without commenting what I had saved. That became my secret and my torment. In the following days, I went home as if I had no body. I went to work, fulfilled my schedule, attended other patients, but every time I opened a new protocol, my eye hit the metadata. Name, time, bed, everything started to seem unsafe. A week later, on impulse, I requested access to the old scan archive. I went to the digital archiving sector and found Michael's case. There were the CTs from 2015, the same angle, the same forgotten blade, the same body positioning. The only difference, the version I did that night had better resolution. Technology evolved, but it was him. What makes me question to this day is, if it wasn't him, who was it? Someone falsified the data with absolute perfection, but how would someone access the system and generate a false order with bed, history, and still use my shift for that? And why? And if it was really him, how? I never thought about anything supernatural, never. But this story has no technical explanation. And I'm technical, I'm exact. The margin of error here is zero. If someone tried to simulate an old scan, then it was a much bigger scheme than I can understand. Because someone brought a body or a presence with all of Michael's marks, and disappeared with everything right after. Or worse, maybe it was a test of someone, of some system, of some intelligence that learned to recreate what already was. All I know is that the copy of the scan is still with me. I never showed it, never shared it, but sometimes I open it, look, and force myself to remember. That happened, I saw it. And if tomorrow another Michael appears with another error from the past, I don't know if I continue on the shift, but I know I'm going to scan because the machine shows what's there. The problem is when what's there shouldn't be there anymore. What haunts me most is the precision of it all. Every detail was perfect. The contrast distribution in the tissues, the organ positioning, even the way the metallic object cast shadows in the scan, everything was exactly as it should be for a living body being scanned. But Michael had been dead for 9 years. The system doesn't lie about body presence. When there's no patient, the machine won't even initiate the protocol. It requires weight, heat, density. All of that was there that night. I started keeping a log of unusual incidents. Not paranoia, just documentation. Because after that night, I understood that our equipment, our systems, they record everything. Every photon, every density variation, every metallic echo. The machines don't have imagination. They can't create data that wasn't there. So when I see those images, when I look at the timestamp, when I check the contrast usage logs, I'm not looking at a glitch. I'm looking at proof that something was there. Something that registered as Michael. Something that carried his exact anatomical signature, his surgical history, his metallic burden. The worst part is the silence. No one talks about cases like this. In 16 years, I've heard whispers, seen technicians request station changes, watched radiologists avoid certain time slots. But nobody documents it. Nobody reports it. Because how do you write in an official report that you scanned a dead man? How do you explain to administration that your equipment registered a patient who died nearly a decade ago? You don't. You save the file, you keep quiet, and you hope it doesn't happen again. But it does happen again. Maybe not to me, maybe not in my department, but somewhere in the hospital, in the quiet hours when the machines hum in empty rooms, something slips through. Something that remembers what it was. Something that still carries the weight of its old injuries, its old mistakes, its unfinished business. And when it does, we're there with our scanners and our cameras and our digital eyes, documenting the impossible, one pixel at a time. If I tell this story here, maybe someone will think I'm exaggerating. But what happened that night didn't make it to any newspaper, wasn't on TV, never became a headline. It was erased before it even began. I'm only talking about it now because this week marks 7 years. 7. And I still wake up in the middle of the night with the sound of cracking glass, with the face of the boy who got trapped in the back, and with that phrase from the driver echoing in my head like rotten feedback. They told us to go anyway. That day I was coming back from upstate New York, from a small town called Elmira. My mother had been hospitalized there after a mild stroke, and I went to see her. I stayed 2 days, slept poorly, head full of worry, and needed to get back to Albany that same night because I had a shift the next day. The bus station was already chaos when I arrived. It had been raining since early morning, not just any little drizzle. It was a heavy, dark rain, the kind where the sky seems to be collapsing in anger. The station floor had water up to your ankles, dripping from the ceiling. The generator kept cutting out, and the lights kept flickering. People had plastic bags over their heads, wet backpacks. It looked like a flood scene from an old news report. I had my ticket in hand, and the bus that was supposed to leave at 10:15 was delayed. Then I saw the driver arguing quietly with a guy in a company uniform. I walked close by and only heard this. "That part of the mountain is giving way," I told them. "They're telling us to go carefully. But if that crater opens again, it's going to be on me." He didn't want to go, I heard it, and even so he went. The company ordered it and we all boarded. You might ask now, but didn't anyone do anything? Didn't anyone get off? Didn't anyone protest? The truth is that everyone boarded tired, soaked, afraid of getting stuck there with nowhere to go. There were kids, there was an elderly lady, there was a young man with a dog in his lap. Everyone just wanted to get home. I sat somewhere in the middle of the bus. I didn't really notice who sat behind me. I only remember seeing a pregnant woman near the window, about 3 rows behind me. The driver started up reluctantly, and as soon as the bus left the station, I swear it seemed like the entire city was underwater. The streets had turned into rivers, and the road leading to the highway was already muddy with runoff from the hills. But we continued. The rain didn't let up. With every curve, the bus seemed to skid a little. The wipers couldn't keep up, and sometimes the driver would take his hand off the wheel to wipe the inside of the windshield with a rag. The interior lights were off. Only the front one stayed on, a weak yellow light. About halfway through the trip, after midnight, fatigue hit. Most people were sleeping, heads tilted to the side. I was dozing and waking with every bump, but there was no warning of stops, no communication. Everything in the dark, in silence, until the sound came. A dry, strong crack, like the sound of a tree breaking or earth splitting. The bus swerved sharply to the side. People woke up screaming. I grabbed onto the seat in front of me. The ground shook, and suddenly the back of the bus sank. Literally collapsed into a hole of mud. The back disappeared first, as if it had been pulled. The bus was tilted, the front still on solid ground. The back submerged in a black pit that nobody saw coming. Water rushed in forcefully, windows broke, people trying to unfasten their seatbelts, stumbling, slipping. A woman's scream, a scream that stopped in the middle. The sound of glass cracking behind us, and then the boy's sound. He must have been about 15, maybe 16. He was banging on the window in the back while the water rose. His hand was beating desperately. But there was no way to get there. The seats were already covered, and the mud prevented walking to the back. I couldn't go. Some people managed to get out through the front door, slipping down the embankment. Others broke the side windows, but those who stayed in the back seats didn't have time or a chance. The rain that had seemed strong before now seemed to mock us because it didn't stop even after. We walked in the dark for about 15 minutes until we found a simple house with a wooden fence. We knocked on the door. An old man answered, called emergency services. When we came back with help, the bus was already buried up to half. You could only see the roof and the front sign. Bodies floating, others disappeared. And that's when the most disgusting part began. The company arrived first. They came with an official car, lawyer, transport manager. And the first thing they said was, "The official list has already been sent to the authorities. There's nobody besides those registered." But there were. I remember the pregnant woman, the boy at the window, the man with the dog, and none of those names were on the list. The next day there was no longer any bus at the location. Just the wreckage collected, and the embankment disturbed, as if they had run a bulldozer over it to hide everything. The story that came out in 2 local newspapers talked about accidents without fatalities caused by excessive rain volume and driver imprudence on isolated stretches. They used a plural that offended me. There weren't other drivers. There was only him, the same one who warned that he shouldn't go. They didn't talk about the road giving way. They didn't talk about the order that came from the company headquarters in New York City. And especially, they didn't talk about the people who weren't on the list, because that was the part that hurt the most. More than the cold water on the skin, more than the screams, more than the cracking glass and the boy banging with his fist, the greatest pain was the silence, the manipulation of evidence, the death of the wrong people, and the clean cover-up on top. The next day they called us aside, the survivors. We were put in a hotel room. 2 men in ties came with company badges on their chests. One of them spoke quieter, the other spoke with anger disguised as professionalism. They said we had been very lucky, that there were no culprits, and that it would be better for everyone if the story stayed the way it was, so as not to complicate things. Those were the words, so as not to complicate things. I remember a lady who had lost her brother in the accident. She didn't know he had boarded. He had caught the bus at the last minute. She started crying there, saying she needed his name recognized at least so she could bury him. They looked at her with pity, but it wasn't the pity of someone who understands. It was the pity of someone who's going to leave it at that. They offered money, signatures, said they would cover all costs. But for that, we needed to confirm the official version, that the bus swerved due to driver error and that all names were on the trip list. I didn't sign. I left there without saying anything more. I didn't report it, I didn't go after the press, I didn't talk to a lawyer, and that eats me up inside to this day, because that boy, the one in the back, he's not on any death certificate. There was no candle, no coffin, no one to cry his name on a headstone. And I know he existed because his eyes, they look at me when I close mine. The week after, his mother appeared at the bus station asking about a missing son. She showed a photo. It was him, with the same hoodie, the same messy hair, crooked smile. She didn't even know he had boarded. He had run away from home. The company said he wasn't on the list, and if he wasn't on it, then he didn't exist. There was a girl I met 2 years later by chance at a gas station. She had lost her baby on that bus. She looked at me and said, "My son died under the earth, and to them, he never even breathed." You understand what that is? It's the kind of terror that doesn't give you fear. It gives you disgust. It gives you a dull, cold pain that grows with time. Because it's not just the memory of the accident. It's the memory that nobody paid. That there were people who disappeared, who were erased, and that the living were bought. At the time, my mother was already not speaking properly. She got worse after I came back. She became quieter, more absent. And when I went to visit her days later, she held my hand and said, "You didn't come back whole." And it was true. I didn't come back, not all of me. Inside that bus, a piece of me stayed trapped between the seats, sunk in the mud with all the names that were torn from the list. So if you made it this far listening to this story, just do me a favor. Don't believe it when they say there were no victims. Don't believe it when they say it was just the rain's fault, or when they say only the names on the list matter, because sometimes the forgotten ones are the ones who scream the loudest. But nobody listens, because it's easier to bury than to admit. And if there's one thing I learned that night, it's this. There are buses that should never have left, and there are truths that never left there either. Welcome, everyone. Before I begin this story, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time of day you prefer to hear these tales. Please leave me a comment. Without further delay, let's start. My name is Jake, and the story I'm about to tell you happened a couple of years ago, when I decided to take a trip to a remote town in the Appalachian Mountains. At that time in my life, all I wanted was to escape the routine, the city noise, the daily pressures weighing me down like stones in my chest. So I made an impulsive decision and bought a Greyhound bus ticket to some isolated place where the promise of tranquility called to me like a siren song. I never imagined that trip would become something I'd never forget, something that would change how I see the world around me. It was a rainy autumn afternoon, the kind where the sky hangs low and heavy like a wet wool blanket. Rain hammered against the bus window with a monotonous rhythm that seemed to lull me into a trance. Outside, the landscape was an endless expanse of rolling mountains and dense forests, their peaks disappearing into thick gray clouds. The empty roads wound through valleys where mist began to swallow everything whole, making the world outside look like a forgotten dream. I had boarded the bus in Richmond, Virginia, but as we traveled deeper into increasingly narrow and isolated mountain roads, I realized there were no longer any signs of life anywhere. The scattered farmhouses and gas stations grew fewer and fewer, until only a handful of ramshackle cabins remained in the distance, hidden among the towering pines and oak trees like secrets the forest was reluctant to reveal. The weather was getting worse by the hour, and for some reason, the driver began to slow down, as if he was taking extra precautions against the storm that seemed to be building around us. The journey had already lasted more than 4 hours when the bus made a stop at a place I had never heard of before. A rusted sign at the edge of the road announced the name of a town that didn't ring any bells at all: Hollow Creek. Without thinking much about it, I got off the bus. I knew my final destination was still far away, but I thought maybe I could stretch my legs a bit while the driver took advantage of the break to rest and grab some coffee. The stop where I found myself was small and weathered, with a corrugated metal roof that protected anyone who might have once waited there for transport to other places. However, that day it seemed the station was completely empty. abandoned like so many small towns across rural America. The only signs of life were some broken wooden benches that looked like they hadn't been sat on in years, and a small brick structure that appeared to be a general store. But the windows were boarded up with old, warped plywood. The atmosphere was strange and unsettling, as if time had stopped in that place decades ago and never bothered to start again. I looked toward the horizon and saw the storm had intensified dramatically. Rain fell in thick sheets that reminded me of steel curtains. The wind whipped with increasing force, and the sound of water hitting the ground was becoming deafening. There were no other passengers on the bus, just me and the driver, who had gotten off to smoke a cigarette beside the vehicle while checking something under the hood. I walked around the station looking for something that might relieve my boredom, or at least give me an idea of what happened in this forgotten place. That's when I noticed the people emerging from the shadows like figures from a half-remembered nightmare. A man with a somber appearance appeared at the entrance to the boarded-up store. He wore a long-sleeved flannel shirt, dirty and soaked, and a worn baseball cap that partially covered his weathered face. He didn't seem to be waiting for anyone in particular. He simply observed in my direction, as if he was expecting something specific to happen, something that I couldn't begin to understand. Somehow his presence struck me as strange, but I couldn't explain why. Every instinct told me something was off about this whole situation. I decided to approach him without taking my eyes off the man. But after taking just 2 steps toward him, he turned around quickly and disappeared into the store through a door I hadn't even noticed was open. I stood there somewhat confused and increasingly uncomfortable. He hadn't waved, hadn't made a single gesture to acknowledge my presence or approach me. His attitude, though apparently normal on the surface, made me feel deeply uneasy, like I was being evaluated by some unseen jury. I decided to return to the bus stop, where the vehicle was still parked with its engine idling. The driver was no longer in sight, which seemed odd because only a couple of minutes had passed since I saw him step outside. I felt an urgent need to get back inside the vehicle. But before I could take a step, an elderly woman appeared from among the nearby trees, like something conjured from the mist itself. She was a hunched figure with a deeply wrinkled face and an absent expression that seemed to look through me rather than at me. Her long gray hair fell over her shoulders like a shroud, and her eyes, though small and somewhat cloudy, seemed to be fixed on me with a disturbing intensity that made my skin crawl. "The weather's changing," she said in a low voice, barely a whisper, as she walked toward me with shuffling steps. Her accent was strange and hard to place, as if she was speaking from very far away, or perhaps from a different time altogether. I didn't know how to respond, but I nodded uncomfortably, trying to maintain some semblance of politeness. "Where are you headed, son?" she asked, and I felt her eyes boring into mine with an indescribable curiosity that seemed to see straight through to my soul. I was about to tell her I was waiting for the bus, but before I could open my mouth, the woman let out a short laugh, almost like a murmur of amusement. "This town doesn't have any more buses," she said, and her tone was so firm and final that it made me doubt everything for an instant. The way she said it wasn't like someone sharing information. It was like someone delivering a verdict. I didn't dare argue, but fear began to take hold of me like ice water in my veins. Something was definitely not right about this place or these people. Suddenly, Another figure appeared behind her, materializing from the gray afternoon like a ghost. It was a middle-aged man with sparse facial hair and a lost, distant look in his eyes. He approached the elderly woman without saying a word, and both of them stood there observing me in complete silence. The rain continued to fall with relentless force, but the atmosphere was becoming increasingly heavy and oppressive, as if the humidity in the air had thickened to the point where I could almost taste it. I felt trapped, as if the atmosphere itself was wrapping around me in some invisible way. Like spider silk, I couldn't see, but could definitely feel. The woman wouldn't take her eyes off me, and the man remained there beside her without speaking, both of them studying me with an intensity that made my heart race. Again, the rain showed no signs of stopping, but something in their gazes made me realize that at that moment, I couldn't trust them. Something deep in my gut told me I shouldn't stay there much longer, but I found I couldn't move, as if my feet had grown roots. Somehow I felt completely paralyzed, caught between the overwhelming urge to run and the strange compulsion to stay and find out what they wanted from me. It was then that a loud noise shattered the oppressive silence like a gunshot. The bus engine roared to life with a mechanical growl. I spun around quickly and saw the driver climbing back behind the wheel, his movements urgent and purposeful. My reaction was immediate and instinctive. I ran toward the bus without looking back, driven by a primal fear I couldn't name or understand. Something in the air, something in the way those people looked at me, told me that if I stayed even one more minute, I might never leave that place. I boarded the bus without hesitation, and the driver, without saying a single word or making eye contact, quickly closed the doors with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like a sigh of relief. I looked through the rain-streaked window at the bus stop and saw that the two strangers remained there, watching me with those same unblinking stares, motionless as scarecrows in a field. The elderly woman smiled at me, but that smile wasn't kind or welcoming. It was an empty smile, devoid of warmth or humanity, like the grin of a skull. The bus began to move, and soon the station disappeared into the distance behind us, swallowed by the rain and mist. But I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened back there, couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. Something was fundamentally wrong with that town and the people in it. The people there didn't seem entirely human, not in the way we're accustomed to understanding other people. The way they moved, their gestures, the distant attitude they displayed, everything seemed unnatural, as if they were playing roles in some cosmic drama I didn't understand. That was the last time I was ever in Hollow Creek, and since then, I haven't been able to forget that day or the chill that runs down my spine whenever I think about it. I never managed to find any information about the place online or in any travel guides, as if no one had ever heard of it, as if it existed in some pocket dimension that occasionally intersects with our own world. I've wondered many times since whether what happened was real, or if my mind had played some cruel trick on me, brought on by exhaustion and the isolation of that stormy afternoon. However, whenever I remember that day, a sensation of cold runs through my entire body, and part of me still doesn't understand what occurred at that abandoned stop, or why those inhabitants behaved in such a deeply unsettling way. Today, as I record this story, I realize I never encountered anyone from that place again. and I don't know if I should be grateful for that or terrified by what it might mean. But what I do know is that, although it seems incredible and impossible, I've never been able to erase that image from my memory. The image of that woman smiling as the bus pulled away. That empty, lifeless smile that remains burned into my mind like a brand, haunting my dreams and reminding me that there are places in this world where the normal rules don't seem to apply. It was a gray Thursday when I decided I needed to get out, even if it was just to clear my mind and escape the suffocating routine that had been weighing me down like a lead blanket. Rain had been falling without pause throughout the entire day, and the heavy clouds darkened the sky so completely that it gave the sensation that the whole world had been put on pause, suspended in some kind of limbo between day and night. The city, which was always filled with noise and constant movement, seemed to have been plunged into a heavy, oppressive silence that made even the familiar streets feel foreign and unwelcoming. I, as always when life became too overwhelming, found myself searching for excuses to get away from my daily routines and responsibilities. So I chose to do something simple and solitary: walk along the forest trail I knew so well, the one that bordered the dense woods on the eastern edge of Portland. That trail, covered with damp earth and slippery stones that glistened like black pearls in the dim light, had always served as my escape from the pressures of modern life. I had walked it countless times before, usually during the warmer months when I enjoyed walking alone among the towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks that in other seasons offered shade and cool relief from the Oregon heat. But today, with the constant rain and the approaching winter, the landscape was entirely different, somber, almost menacing in its wild beauty. The thunder rumbled in the distance like the growling of some massive, unseen beast. But the storm didn't seem as intense as other times I'd experienced in the Pacific Northwest. So I decided to continue my walk despite the weather. At first, everything seemed fairly normal and familiar. The trail narrowed as I ventured deeper into the forest, and the rain fell on my head and face with increasing intensity, but I didn't mind at all. On the contrary, I felt liberated, as if each drop that fell on my skin was a form of purification, washing away the stress and anxiety that had been building up inside me for weeks. The forest, humid and silent except for the whisper of rain through the canopy, seemed to breathe with me in perfect rhythm. The ancient trees surrounded me like old friends, their branches trembling with the wind that sometimes blew intermittently through the valleys and ridges of the Cascade foothills. Suddenly, after a couple of hours of walking under the steadily falling rain, I came to a section of the trail I had never noticed before, though I was certain I had walked this path dozens of times over the years. The path curved sharply to the left, leading into a small hill covered with thick undergrowth and low-growing shrubs that seemed to form an almost impenetrable barrier. At the top of the hill, barely visible from my position through the mist and rain, I could make out what appeared to be an old house, its outline ghostly and indistinct against the gray sky. I had never noticed anything resembling a dwelling the previous times I had hiked through this area, so I decided to get closer out of curiosity more than anything else, driven by the kind of inexplicable compulsion that sometimes overtakes us when we encounter the unexpected. When I reached what must have once been the boundaries of a garden or yard, the scene that greeted me was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The house was a construction of weathered wood, rising several stories into the air, and it appeared to be almost completely falling apart. Its windows were broken and jagged, giving the interior a dark and ghostly appearance that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. The wooden doors hung crookedly from their frames like broken teeth, and the walls, covered with thick moss and various species of fungi, showed the devastating effects of years of neglect and exposure to the harsh Pacific Northwest weather. Rain fell steadily on the sagging roof, creating a monotonous sound that added an extra layer of melancholy to the already haunting atmosphere of abandonment. No one in their right mind would dare approach such a building under these conditions, especially alone and in this kind of weather. Nevertheless, something compelled me to keep walking toward it, perhaps driven by the storm, or maybe because I wasn't quite ready to return to the city and face the mundane problems waiting for me there. I approached the front door more out of politeness and curiosity than any real expectation of receiving an answer. To my complete surprise, the door opened slowly and silently, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment. An elderly man appeared in the doorway, materializing from the shadows like something from another era entirely. He had long gray hair that fell past his shoulders, a thick beard that had gone completely white with age, and deep-set eyes that seemed to have witnessed more than any ordinary person could imagine or process. His face, deeply lined by time and marked with the scars that life inevitably leaves on all of us, was like a living painting of suffering and hard-earned wisdom that spoke of decades of solitude. The clothes he wore were soaked through, though he didn't seem to mind or even notice the cold and dampness that would have sent most people running for shelter. The first thing he said to me was, well, a visitor in weather like this. It's not common for someone to venture up here, especially when the sky is throwing everything it has at us. Are you lost, young man, or are you running from something? I smiled somewhat awkwardly, feeling like an intruder despite his apparently welcoming demeanor, and explained that I was simply looking for a bit of shelter from the storm. The rain seemed determined to continue indefinitely, and his house, despite its obvious state of disrepair, seemed to offer the protection and warmth I desperately needed. Of course, please come in," the old man said without hesitation, stepping aside and gesturing for me to enter. "I'll make you a cup of tea. There's nothing more comforting when the rain pounds the roof like this, when nature reminds us just how small and vulnerable we really are." I entered the house cautiously, not knowing what to expect from the interior. The inside was dark and filled with shadows, lit only by a weak, yellowish light that barely allowed me to see the furniture, which was scattered throughout the rooms and covered with thick layers of dust that spoke of years of neglect. However, there was something peculiar and almost magical about the atmosphere within those walls. Despite the obvious humidity and the visible cracks running through the walls like spider webs, the place had a warm smell about it, as if it was somehow preserved from the passage of time, suspended in some pocket dimension where decay moved more slowly than in the outside world. The old man led me through a narrow hallway into a small living room that featured a cold fireplace and a pair of ancient armchairs that looked as though they had been comfortable once upon a time. many years ago. He invited me to sit down with a gesture that carried an old-world courtesy I hadn't experienced in years. "What's your name, son?" he asked as he moved toward a small table where, with trembling fingers that spoke of advanced age, he began to prepare tea using a ritual that seemed to have been performed countless times before. "My name is Chris," I replied, watching as the man carefully placed dried leaves into an iron teapot that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Chris Thompson." "Chris, that's a good, solid name," he said with a slight smile that seemed to carry memories of other times and other conversations. "It reminds me of someone I used to know long ago. My name is Eugene, though most folks who knew me called me Old Gene. And as I mentioned, it's not common for someone to venture into these parts, especially during a storm like this one that seems determined to wash the whole world clean." I sat there watching with growing curiosity and a slight sense of unease as the old man continued his tea preparation. Something about his manner of speaking was strangely familiar, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. It was as if I had heard his voice before, perhaps in a dream, or in some half-remembered conversation from childhood. For several minutes, while the tea began to release its earthy aroma into the air, we talked about the weather and the general situation in the region. But as our conversation progressed, I couldn't help but notice certain peculiarities in Old Gene's words and responses. Sometimes his answers seemed disconnected from reality, as if he wasn't entirely present in what he was saying, as if part of his mind was dwelling in some other time or place entirely. More than once, he stared at me intently, as if he expected me to say something specific, something important that I wasn't prepared or able to articulate. At one point, while taking a sip of the surprisingly excellent tea, I gathered the courage to ask, "How is it that you live here in such an old house? There doesn't seem to be anyone else around for miles, no neighbors, no town nearby. Doesn't it get lonely?" Old Gene seemed surprised by my question at first, but then he responded with a calm, measured tone, almost as if he was giving me an answer he had rehearsed many times before. "Well, this house has been mine for more years than I care to count," he said, his voice taking on a distant quality. "There used to be other people around here, a whole community actually, but they gradually moved away, went to the cities where life was easier and more predictable. I decided to stay behind, though as you can see, time doesn't forgive anyone or anything, including old houses and old men." His tone was so flat and emotionless that it made me feel there was something significant in his story that didn't quite add up, some important piece of information that was being deliberately withheld. Something about his words created an uncomfortable dissonance in my mind. The house, although clearly deteriorated and showing its age, didn't seem to have been completely abandoned for as long as he suggested. The windows, the walls, the basic structure, everything appeared to be intact and functional, existing in a kind of suspended animation that defied easy explanation. "What happened to all the other people?" I asked, unable to suppress my growing curiosity about this place and its history. Old Gene remained silent for what felt like an eternity, as if he was carefully considering his words and their potential consequences. Finally, he looked toward the window where the rain was beginning to diminish slightly, and I could see something shift in his expression. "What happens is that sometimes people leave, and other times they simply disappear," he said in a voice so quiet I had to strain to hear him. I chose to stay when everyone else went away. All the people who came here over the years, they all eventually left, one way or another. I never really knew what became of most of them. This place has a history that not many people want to remember or talk about. Something in his response sent a chill down my spine, as if he was concealing something crucial and potentially dangerous. I wanted to ask more questions, to dig deeper into the mystery that seemed to surround this place like morning fog. But at that moment, the rain stopped completely and abruptly. The silence that followed was thick and almost tangible, pressing down on us like a physical weight. And for a long moment, I wasn't sure whether I should leave immediately or stay and try to learn more about this enigmatic man and his strange house in the woods. "Well, it looks like the rain has finally passed," I said, with the clear intention of making my departure before the situation became any more uncomfortable than it already was. "Thank you so much for the tea and for providing shelter. I should probably head back before it gets dark." However, when I stood up to leave, I noticed that old Gene didn't move from his chair. He simply continued to stare at me with that intense, almost desperate expression, as if he was waiting for something specific to happen, something that only he understood. "Chris," he said in a voice so low I could barely hear it above the dripping of water from the roof, "are you absolutely certain you want to leave? This place, you see, this place is much more than just a house. Here, things never really go away completely. The past has a way of staying alive, of keeping people connected to it, whether they want to be or not." A shiver ran through my entire body without any logical explanation I could provide. Something in his tone told me he wasn't speaking metaphorically or philosophically. There was a literalness to his words that terrified me in a way I couldn't articulate. I looked toward the door and the outside world, and although it now appeared calm and peaceful, it seemed somehow more distant than before, as if the trail I had taken to reach this place had changed in some fundamental way, as if the path back to civilization might no longer exist. "I'm sorry, but I really do need to go," I said with a firmness I didn't entirely feel, trying to convince myself as much as him that leaving was the right decision. Old Gene made no attempt to stop me physically, but before I could take a step toward the door, he spoke again in that same unnervingly quiet voice. "Remember, Chris," he said, his words seeming to hang in the air like smoke, "some paths can't be retraced once you've walked them, and if you ever need to come back, if you ever find yourself lost or in need of shelter again, you'll know where to find me. I'll be here, just as I always have been." I left the house quickly, feeling the cold afternoon air hit my face like a slap back to reality. The storm had indeed passed, but something in the atmosphere remained charged and electric, as if the weather hadn't finished with us completely, as if it was merely gathering strength for another assault. I walked back along the trail without daring to look over my shoulder, driven by an irrational fear that if I turned around, I might see something I wasn't prepared to understand or accept. When I finally reached the main trail that led back to the city, something deep in my gut told me that my encounter with old Gene hadn't been coincidental or random. And although I tried desperately to forget about the whole experience in the days and weeks that followed, I knew there was something more to that house, to that man, and to his cryptic story that I should never have been curious enough to ask about. Some doors, I realized, are better left unopened, and some questions are better left unasked. Even now, months later, when I walk that familiar trail through the Oregon woods, I find myself looking for that strange path that led up the hill, searching for some sign that the house and old Jean really existed. But I've never found that turnoff again, never seen any trace of the dwelling that sheltered me from the storm. Sometimes I wonder if it was all an elaborate hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the hypnotic effect of the rain. But other times, when the weather turns gray and stormy, I can still smell that distinctive aroma of old wood and damp earth, still hear old Jean's voice echoing in my memory, still feel the weight of his words about paths that can't be retraced. And on those days, I find myself walking a little faster through the woods, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the main trail ahead, afraid that if I look too closely into the shadows between the trees, I might see that familiar path leading up into the hills, and I might not have the strength to resist following it once again into whatever mystery waits at the end. My name is Alex, and I've never been particularly fond of traveling by train, despite the romantic notions that many people associate with rail travel across America. Although there's something undeniably soothing about the steady rhythm of wheels on steel tracks, and the hypnotic way the landscape rolls past the windows, I've always preferred the control and independence that comes with having a steering wheel in my hands and the open road ahead of me. However, that particular day I found myself in a situation I hadn't planned for, stranded in circumstances that would force me to depend on public transportation in ways I had always managed to avoid. I had traveled to a small, remote town in rural Nebraska to handle some business matters related to my late uncle's estate, and I had planned to drive back to Chicago that same evening using my rental car. But an unexpected late-season thunderstorm that appeared seemingly from nowhere changed all my carefully laid plans in a matter of hours. It was a late October afternoon when the sky had been overcast since noon, but by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the rain began to fall with such sudden violence and intensity that it seemed as if the heavens themselves had split open and were pouring their entire contents onto the Nebraska plains. I was sitting in the small, antiquated train station that served this forgotten corner of America, watching the old analog clock that hung crookedly on the waiting room wall, and listening to the relentless drumming of rain against windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in decades. My train was supposed to have departed over an hour ago, but there were no signs that the storm was going to diminish anytime soon, and the station master had made vague announcements about delays due to weather conditions and track safety concerns. The wind outside was howling like a living thing, making the rain strike the windows with even greater force, and creating a cacophony that was almost deafening. The old station building, which looked like it had been constructed sometime in the 1930s and hadn't been significantly updated since, creaked and groaned under the assault of the storm, as if it was struggling to maintain its structural integrity against forces beyond its design specifications. The waiting area was nearly empty, except for a handful of other stranded travelers who seemed to be trapped by the same meteorological circumstances that had derailed my own plans. There was a man who appeared to be in his 70s, wearing a gray fedora that covered most of his weathered face, sitting motionless in a corner chair, as if he had been there for hours or possibly days. He kept his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see, lost in thoughts or memories that seemed to transport him far away from this dreary place. Across from me sat an elderly woman in a chair that squeaked and protested every time she shifted her weight, as if the furniture itself was as old and tired as the building that housed it. She seemed to be waiting for something or someone, though what or whom remained a mystery that her expression did nothing to clarify. The atmosphere in the station made me increasingly uncomfortable as the minutes dragged by. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls and creating an almost strobe-like effect that was disorienting and headache-inducing. The penetrating cold from an overactive air conditioning system, combined with the constant sound of rain and wind battering the building, created a sensation of claustrophobia that made me feel trapped in a place where time had stopped moving forward sometime around the Eisenhower administration. The station was small and cramped, with walls painted in a shade of institutional green that had probably been considered modern and cheerful when it was first applied, but now looked faded and depressing. In one corner stood a vintage vending machine that made strange mechanical noises every time someone tried to use it, though it never seemed to actually dispense any products. Everything in the place was tinged with an oppressive atmosphere, as if time had become thick and viscous in this forgotten corner of the American Midwest, moving so slowly that each minute felt like an hour. Several more minutes passed in this uncomfortable limbo when the elderly woman, who had been observing me in complete silence since I arrived, suddenly began to speak. She didn't raise her voice or make any dramatic gestures, but spoke just loudly enough that I could hear her words above the storm's relentless assault on the building. Her voice was soft and broken, like someone who had been silent for far too long and was struggling to remember how human conversation was supposed to work. "It's almost time," she said, looking directly at me with eyes that seemed to see far more than they should have been able to. "The train will be here soon." I didn't understand what she meant by this cryptic statement, but the way she looked at me made me deeply uncomfortable. Her gaze wasn't casual or disinterested like the look strangers typically exchange in public places. It was intense and probing, as if she was analyzing me for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom, studying me like a specimen under a microscope. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady and hide the growing unease that was creeping through my nervous system like ice water in my veins. "The train was supposed to be here over an hour ago. Do you know something about the schedule that I don't?" She smiled then, a gesture so subtle it was almost imperceptible, and her response was even more enigmatic and unsettling than her initial comment had been. "The train knows more about you than you realize," she said in that same mysterious tone that seemed to carry hidden meanings I couldn't decode. "It's been waiting for the right moment, the right passenger. Some journeys can't begin until the traveler is truly ready to take them." Her words sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Something in her tone suggested she wasn't speaking metaphorically or philosophically, but was instead conveying information about some concrete reality that I was failing to grasp. I felt a strange pressure building in the air around me, as if I was being observed and evaluated by forces beyond my perception or understanding. I decided to ignore her cryptic pronouncements, convinced that she was simply an eccentric old woman whose mind had been affected by too many years of solitude, or perhaps by the disorienting effects of the storm. But the man in the corner, who until that moment had shown no interest in anyone else in the waiting room, slowly lifted his head and looked directly at me with an expression that was even more disturbing than the woman's intense stare. His gaze wasn't friendly or curious or even neutral. It was knowing and somehow predatory, as if he recognized something about me that I didn't recognize about myself. Several seconds passed before his lips moved, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible above the noise of wind and rain hammering the station. "You know, don't you?" he said in a tone so quiet I had to strain to hear him. "You understand what the train really wants from you, what it's been waiting all this time to collect." His comment left me completely speechless and filled with a fear I couldn't name or explain. What could this stranger possibly know about me? How could both of these people, who had never seen me before in their lives, seem to share some hidden knowledge about my presence here? Some understanding of my situation that I myself didn't possess. I looked quickly back at the elderly woman, but she was no longer watching me. Instead, she had turned her attention to the rain-streaked window, staring out into the storm as if she expected to see something materializing from the darkness and chaos outside. I tried to shake off the growing sense of dread and paranoia, telling myself that coincidence and the stressful circumstances of being stranded were combining to make me imagine threats and conspiracies where none actually existed. But the man's words kept echoing in my mind, repeating themselves over and over again like a broken record. "You know what the train really wants from you." The rain continued to fall with undiminished fury, and the sound of water striking glass mixed with the whispered conversations and strange silences that filled the waiting room like a fog of unspoken secrets. I checked the old clock on the wall repeatedly, watching as the minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. According to the posted schedule, my train should have arrived at 6:15, but it was now well past 7:30, and there was still no sign of any approaching locomotive or any official announcement about when service might resume. The woman sighed deeply, a sound that seemed to carry resignation and perhaps relief, as if this delay was exactly what she had expected all along. "It takes longer than you think," she murmured with a calmness that was deeply unsettling given the circumstances. "It never arrives when you expect it to. The train operates according to its own schedule, its own sense of time and purpose." I felt as if I was trapped in a place from which there was no escape, caught in some kind of temporal loop where normal rules of cause and effect no longer applied. I couldn't understand what was happening, or why I felt so completely out of place and disconnected from reality. I looked around the waiting room one more time, searching for some logical explanation for the strange behavior of my fellow passengers and the increasingly surreal atmosphere that seemed to be thickening around us like fog. The man in the corner was no longer visible in his chair, though I hadn't seen him leave or heard any movement in his direction. The station now felt empty except for the woman and myself, isolated in this forgotten place while the storm raged outside. At exactly 8 o'clock, according to the station clock, something extraordinary happened. The woman slowly stood up from her chair and began walking toward the door that led to the platform. There was no fear in her movements, no uncertainty or hesitation. She moved with the calm confidence of someone who had experienced this exact sequence of events many times before and knew precisely what to expect. Before stepping outside into the storm, she paused and turned back to look at me one final time. With a voice that was almost inaudible, but somehow carried perfect clarity, she said, "The train already came for me years ago, but it's still waiting patiently for you. When you're ready to understand what that means, you'll know what to do." And with that cryptic farewell, she walked out into the rain and disappeared into the darkness, as if she had never existed at all. I remained alone in the station, feeling more isolated and confused than I had ever felt in my entire life. The minutes stretched endlessly, and the sound of the storm seemed to grow even louder and more chaotic, as if nature itself was building towards some kind of climactic moment that I couldn't predict or prepare for. Finally, after what felt like hours, but may have been only minutes, something in the atmosphere began to change dramatically. The air in the station became thick and heavy, almost viscous, as if everything around me was floating in some kind of supernatural suspension. It was then that I heard the unmistakable sound of a train approaching, the rhythmic clacking of wheels on steel tracks growing steadily louder and more distinct. I turned quickly toward the window, my heart pounding with a mixture of relief and inexplicable terror, and saw the headlight of a locomotive cutting through the storm like a sword through black cloth. But something about this train was fundamentally wrong, different from any rail transport I had ever seen or imagined. The light was cold and blue-white, too bright and too focused, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The cars that followed seemed to glide rather than roll, moving with an eerie smoothness that defied the laws of physics as I understood them. There was no sound of engines or mechanical systems, no whistle or bell, or any of the normal auditory signatures associated with trains. The locomotive came to a stop outside the station, with a silence that was somehow more unsettling than any noise could have been. The passenger door opened with a soft hiss, revealing an interior that was completely dark, except for a faint, phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I stared into that empty car and knew, with absolute certainty, that this was not the train I had been waiting for, not the normal commercial transport that was supposed to carry me back to Chicago and my ordinary life. This train was something else entirely, something that operated according to rules and purposes that existed far beyond human understanding. As I stood there frozen between the overwhelming urge to run and the strange compulsion to board, I realized that somehow this mysterious locomotive knew more about me than I knew about myself. It had been waiting for me, perhaps for years, and now it was offering me a journey to a destination I couldn't name or imagine, with every instinct screaming at me to stay away, to remain in the safety of the familiar, even if it meant being stranded indefinitely. I found myself taking step after step toward that open door. Something deep in my subconscious understood that if I boarded this train, I would never return to my old life, never again be the person I had been before this storm brought me to this forgotten station. At the last possible moment, as my foot was about to cross the threshold into that impossibly dark car, A small spark of rational thought managed to break through the supernatural compulsion that was drawing me forward. With an effort that cost me more strength than I thought I possessed, I stopped myself and stepped backward, away from the train and whatever destiny it represented. The door closed immediately with that same soft hiss, and the train began to move again, accelerating smoothly and silently, until it disappeared completely into the storm, taking with it all evidence that it had ever existed. I stood there on the empty platform, soaked by rain and shaking from more than just the cold, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally returned to the waiting room, I found it exactly as it had been hours earlier, as if time had reset itself while I was outside confronting that impossible locomotive. The next morning, a perfectly ordinary Amtrak train arrived on schedule to carry me and several other passengers back to civilization. The conductor was friendly and professional. The cars were clean and well-maintained, and the journey proceeded without incident. But I couldn't stop thinking about the previous night, about the mysterious passengers who had seemed to know me better than I knew myself, and about the otherworldly train that had offered me passage to some unimaginable destination. I never discovered what had really been waiting for me in that dark car, or what would have happened if I had found the courage, or perhaps the foolishness, to step aboard. But even now, months later, whenever I hear a train whistle in the distance or see railroad tracks stretching toward the horizon, I wonder if somewhere out there in the vast network of rails that connects this country, that strange locomotive is still running its route, still searching for passengers who are ready to take the ultimate journey to wherever it is that trains like that are destined to go. My name is Mike, and I've never been one of those people who enjoys horror stories, urban legends, or dark tales that keep you awake at night. I've always preferred quiet afternoons, perfectly brewed coffee, and peaceful reading sessions in my favorite armchair. However, the story I'm about to tell you occurred on an ordinary afternoon in a small mountain town somewhere along the highways of Montana. And since then, it has haunted me in a way I never expected, following me like a shadow I can't shake. It was a Thursday in late October, an afternoon that had started with light drizzle, but soon transformed into an unexpected deluge that seemed to come from nowhere. I was driving back from a business meeting in a small town near the Canadian border, and since there weren't many route options available, I decided to take a secondary highway that, although longer and more winding, promised to be more tranquil and less crowded than the main interstate that was always packed with 18-wheelers and impatient commuters. There was something deeply peaceful about the landscape, the Rocky Mountains looming in the background like ancient sentinels, the mist weaving between the towering pine trees like ghostly fingers, that gave me a certain calm, something nostalgic that reminded me of childhood camping trips with my father. However, the storm hit with tremendous force just as I was passing through a particularly isolated stretch of the route, miles from any town or even a gas station. The visibility was reduced to just a few yards ahead of my windshield, and my car began to slide slightly on the pools of water that accumulated in the low spots of the asphalt like treacherous mirrors. Although the sound of rain hammering my roof and the thunder rolling across the mountains was absolutely deafening, there was nothing but absolute silence beyond the walls of my vehicle. A silence so complete it felt almost supernatural. It was then that I saw a dim light in the distance along the highway, a beacon of hope cutting through the storm like a lighthouse in a sea of darkness. A small roadside cafe that stood out against the gray afternoon like salvation itself. I decided to stop there, not only because I desperately needed shelter from the relentless rain, but because hunger and fatigue were beginning to take their toll on my concentration and nerves. When I got out of my car, the cold mountain water soaked me to the bone instantly, chilling me in a way that seemed to penetrate right to my soul. But when I crossed the threshold of the cafe, the warm and welcoming atmosphere was an immediate relief that felt like stepping into an entirely different world. The place was modest, but decorated with genuine care and attention to detail. Solid wooden tables that looked handcrafted, walls covered with sepia-toned photographs of the local area from what looked like the 1930s and 40s, and a wood-burning stove crackling merrily in one corner that made the air smell of wet earth and burning cedar. The soft yellow light from vintage fixtures created a warm glow that contrasted beautifully with the furious storm raging outside the windows. A man behind the counter looked up at me with a slight smile while methodically cleaning a ceramic mug with practiced movements. "Welcome, friend," he said in a voice that carried the distinctive accent of the mountain regions. "I can offer you something hot if you'd like. Looks like this storm isn't going to let up anytime soon, and you look like you could use some warming up." I nodded gratefully, still dripping wet, and asked for black coffee. No cream, no sugar, just something strong and hot to clear my head and warm my bones. While he prepared my drink with the careful attention of someone who takes pride in his craft, I noticed I wasn't alone in this refuge from the storm. At a nearby table sat a couple, a man who appeared to be in his 60s, with the weathered look of someone who had spent his life working outdoors, and a woman with her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun that gave her an almost severe appearance. Both were sitting in complete silence, almost motionless, staring out the rain-streaked window without speaking to each other or acknowledging each other's presence in any way. It didn't strike me as particularly strange at first. People often seek shelter from storms in contemplative silence, lost in their own thoughts. But something about their absolute stillness and the way they seemed frozen in time gradually began to unsettle me. They appeared not even to notice my presence, as if I had entered their world but remained invisible to them. I took my steaming coffee and settled at a table near the window, watching the storm unleash its fury on the landscape outside. The rain pounded against the glass like thousands of tiny hammers, and there was nothing visible beyond except the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the mountains for split seconds before plunging everything back into darkness. The low murmur of conversation between the man and woman was the only human sound besides the crackling of the fire and the drumming of rain. I couldn't help but overhear fragments of what they were saying, though I tried not to be intrusive or appear to be eavesdropping. Their voices carried in the small space despite their attempts to speak quietly. "Are you certain it's safe for us to be here?" the woman asked, her voice carrying a gravelly quality that spoke of years of worry. "I don't feel right about being in this place again. You know what happened before. You remember what we went through." The man, his face etched with lines that seemed to tell stories of hardship and loss, replied with a tone of weary resignation. "I know, Margaret, But we can't change what's in the past. It's better not to talk about it anymore. We're safe here now. We can't let what happened continue to follow us around like a curse. Something in those words made my attention sharpen like a blade. Although I tried not to appear curious or intrusive, a strange sensation of unease began to creep through me like cold fingers along my spine. My mind started forming questions that demanded answers. What had occurred in this place? Why did the atmosphere seem so heavy with unspoken secrets, so charged with an almost electric tension? I decided not to interfere or ask questions, but curiosity began to consume my thoughts like a slow-burning fire. After what felt like an eternity, the man and woman stood up from their table, leaving their coffee almost untouched, the cups still steaming as if they had been forgotten mid-conversation. The man made a slight nod in my direction, as if acknowledging my presence for the first time, but without offering a word of greeting or farewell. The woman, however, looked directly at me before exiting the cafe, her dark eyes seeming to carry within them a pain that hadn't been resolved. Something so deep and profound that it made me profoundly uncomfortable just to meet her gaze. The man remained there for a few more minutes, staring at the rain through the window, as if searching for something in the storm that only he could see. It was at that precise moment when I decided I needed to know more about what had happened in this place, what secrets this small mountain cafe was harboring. Perhaps the storm and the isolation had made me feel bold, or maybe it was just the journalist's instinct that had served me well in my career. Whatever it was, I felt this was the right moment to uncover a mystery that everyone seemed determined to avoid discussing. I approached the counter where the cafe owner continued cleaning mugs and wiping down surfaces with methodical precision. "Excuse me for asking," I said, trying to keep my tone casual and respectful, "but what happened here? I mean, years ago. It seems like this place has some kind of history, and I can't help but feel that something important occurred here, something that people still remember." The man stopped his cleaning and looked up at me, and for an instant his entire demeanor changed. A shadow crossed his weathered face like a cloud passing over the sun, and his eyes took on a distant quality that spoke of memories he'd rather forget. "It's not something I enjoy talking about," he replied, his tone heavy with the weight of years and sorrow. "A long time ago, something tragic happened here, but it's not something people in these parts want to remember. Sometimes it's better to leave certain things buried in the past where they belong." But I pressed him gently, my curiosity overcoming my better judgment. An accident. What kind of accident could have affected this place so deeply? The man studied me carefully, as if weighing whether he should trust me with this burden of knowledge. Finally, he sighed deeply, the sound carrying years of grief, and began to speak. "About 15 years ago," he said, his voice growing softer and more distant, "a group of tourists stopped here, just like you did today. It was a stormy afternoon, much like this one, with rain coming down in sheets and visibility near zero. What they didn't know was that the highway near here runs close to an old bridge that crosses Bear Creek. The bridge looked solid enough from a distance, but it had been weakened by years of flash floods and harsh winters." His voice cracked slightly as he continued, and I could see the pain etched in every line of his face. "In the middle of that storm, their car skidded on the wet pavement and went through the guardrail. The vehicle slid down the embankment and into the creek, which was running high and fast from all the rain. We heard the crash from here, but by the time we got down there, he paused, unable to finish the sentence. There were deaths that night, he continued after a moment. A young family from Denver, parents and 2 small children. Nobody ever understood exactly how it happened, whether it was the water, the impact, or just bad luck. But what I do know is that people changed after that tragedy. This place changed. Nobody came to the cafe for a long time afterward. Some folks said it was cursed, that the mountain had claimed what it wanted. He returned to his cleaning with renewed intensity, as if the physical activity could somehow wash away the memories. The tragedy left its mark on this place, soaked into the very walls and floorboards. Sometimes it's better to forget, to let the dead rest in peace. A heavy silence settled between us like a thick blanket. The man began cleaning again with more urgency, as if he no longer wanted to discuss the matter, and his attitude became more distant and guarded, as if recalling that story had reopened wounds that never properly healed. I left the cafe feeling as though a strange weight had settled on my shoulders like an invisible cloak. The rain had finally stopped, but the air remained cold and dense with moisture and unspoken sorrows. The place where I had taken refuge now seemed different somehow, as if the tragedy the man had shared was still floating in the atmosphere, suspended in the mountain air like morning mist that refuses to lift. The silence that had descended over the highway and the surrounding wilderness felt absolute and profound. With each step I took back to my car, I felt as though something was watching me from the shadows between the trees, something that shouldn't be mentioned or acknowledged, something that the rain and mist were trying desperately to keep hidden from the world. I never returned to that cafe, though I've driven that highway several times since. Sometimes when I pass through that area, I try to avoid looking toward the old building, as if somehow I might be able to sense what happened there all those years ago, as if the echoes of that terrible night might still be reverberating through the mountain air. But the memory of that afternoon, the story that was reluctantly shared, persists in my mind and serves as a constant reminder that sometimes there are things that are better left undisturbed, secrets that should remain buried, and places where the past refuses to stay in the past where it belongs. I don't even know where to begin, honestly. And maybe that's why I've never told this to anyone, not my girlfriend, not my brother, nobody. Because there's no explanation that wouldn't make me seem crazy or guilty. It was supposed to be just another bus trip. I was heading back to Chicago after 3 exhausting days in Milwaukee, settling some estate issues for my father. The kind of thing that messes with your head, you know. Paperwork, bills, and there you are in the house where he died alone, going through drawers, opening closets, dealing with all of it. I chose the 11:15 departure for 2 reasons. It was cheaper, and because I wanted to sleep the entire way. The bus was a semi-sleeper, one of those with dim blue lights inside that makes you drowsy just from sitting down. It wasn't even full. But for some reason, a guy came and sat next to me. There were empty seats available, but he chose right there. He must have been about 60 years old. Worn down face, bald, skin spotted like someone who'd had too much sun in his life. He was sweating, but the night was cold, and he was wearing a flannel shirt buttoned tight at the neck. He stared straight at the seat back in front of him, like he was trying to hear something far away. I didn't pay much attention. I put on my headphones, closed my eyes, and let my body relax. But shortly after midnight, he nudged me gently with the back of his finger. I opened my eyes, startled, and he spoke quietly, almost without moving his lips. "If I fall asleep, wake me up. For the love of God, wake me up." I nodded and slowly took off my headphones, already wondering what kind of problem this guy had. The first thing I thought was that he might have sleep apnea, something that put him at risk if he slept. But that wasn't what scared me. What scared me was the way he started watching me. Every time I threatened to close my eyes, he would lean in a little, as if checking whether I was really going to keep my promise. I started getting nervous because he wasn't dozing, wasn't relaxing, and wouldn't stop sweating. He kept his hand on his knee the whole time. And sometimes I noticed him moving his fingers like he was counting. I swear, he moved his fingers like he was counting time or heartbeats. I don't know what. We were already in the middle of the mountains, those dark curves of Interstate 94, when he nudged me again, his voice even more tremulous. "Don't sleep, okay? Don't let me sleep." I took a deep breath, nodded again, but deep down I started thinking he was having some kind of breakdown, that it must be schizophrenia or something. And I kept waiting for the moment when he would get up and do something. He didn't. He just stayed awake. Time passed very slowly. The driver stopped at one of those truck stops in the middle of nowhere. I got off, ate something. When I came back, the guy was still there. Same position, same way. But now his gaze was more vacant, emptying out like someone losing strength. I thought about changing seats, but something held me back. I think it was curiosity or guilt, I don't know. When it was around 3 a.m, I was dead tired, and so was he. At least it seemed like it. That's when I leaned my head back and said to myself, just 5 minutes. If he fell asleep, too bad. He's not my relative, I did what I could. 5 minutes later, I fell asleep too. I woke up to sudden braking, a dull thud from the back of the bus, people screaming, and the sound of something being dragged on the asphalt. The driver stopped on the shoulder, lights came on, and everything turned into chaos. But before getting up, I looked to the side. The seat was empty. I froze, really froze. I stared at the seat as if it would give me some answer, but it was just empty, no luggage, nothing, as if nobody had been there. I couldn't move for a few seconds. You know when your body goes into standby mode. Because my head was only thinking one thing, where's the man? The entire bus was moving, everyone standing, going to the front door. The driver ran out, talking loudly on his cell phone. Only then did I get up slowly. My knee was shaking. My stomach was churning in a way that made me nauseous. I went to the door and got off. The ground was wet with dew, and the bus lights poorly illuminated the road. There was a body lying there on its side. A man. His head turned forward, arms loose as if he had given up halfway. Barefoot, checkered flannel shirt, dark pants, and the detail that stopped me mid-breath. A scar above the left eyebrow, exactly the same. But seeing that, I refused to believe it. I thought it's just a coincidence, it's someone else. I'm tired, emotionally destroyed, and my head is confusing everything. Until one of the passengers, an older man who got off after me, said something that chilled my spine. Folks, he was standing in the middle of the road, standing with his arms down. It looked like he was waiting for the bus to hit him. Another woman responded, trembling. I saw it too. He didn't run, didn't move, just looked at the headlight. And then, for me, It was like a weight crashed onto my chest because I knew who it was. It was the man from the seat next to me. Same clothes, same posture, same face, but nobody else on the bus remembered him. I swear, nobody. The driver said there was nobody sitting next to me when we boarded. Other passengers said that when they passed by me, I was alone. And now who's going to believe it? Because if I tell them that a man asked me to keep him awake, and that later he died, and nobody ever saw him inside the bus, what I saw, what I let happen. I sat back down completely lost. I tried to remember every detail, but it seems like memory started to fail, like there was sand in the gears. There was even a moment when I thought, did I fall asleep before? Did I dream all of that? But it can't be a dream. I felt his touch. I heard his breathing. I saw the fear in his eyes. And there's something I never told anyone. Before he faded away, he looked at me one last time. His face turned just slightly, almost without moving his eyes, as if he didn't want to draw attention. And he murmured quietly, "If I sleep, he finds me." I thought it was something in his head, some paranoia, a breakdown. But now I keep thinking, who is he? Who was this he that the man feared so much? No news ever came out. They never released the name of the hit-and-run victim. And I searched on the station website, in Chicago newspapers, in Facebook groups. Nothing. Worse yet, 2 days later, when I went to look at my ticket online in the app history, my seat number showed as empty. I called the bus company. They said the system might have had an error, but now I'm afraid to sleep on night buses because there's a question that won't leave me. What if he wasn't a passenger? What if he was just waiting for someone to fall asleep and he fell with me? If you made it this far, it's because you stayed awake with me. Now do something. Subscribe to the channel because there are stories that only reach those who are awake. I never understood why my mother made me dress so nicely when we walked around town, even when we had nowhere special to go. Some days, she would make me put on this little blue dress that pinched my arms, brush my hair until my scalp hurt, and tell me to walk beside her with perfect posture. She used to say that if we didn't have beauty, at least we could have grace. But I was just a kid. All I wanted was to run around and play, not parade down dusty streets like they were fashion runways. This was before the trip. I was 8 years old. That age when you don't understand much of anything, but you can already sense when something's wrong. We lived in a rundown neighborhood outside Bakersfield, California, a place where the city bus barely ran and the streetlights flickered more than they stayed on. My mother was always a quiet woman. She worked doing nails from home, washed other people's clothes, babysat the neighbors' kids. She never had a steady man around, and never let me play outside alone. The strange part happened on a Sunday night. She didn't say anything, just walked into my room with a backpack over her shoulders, turned on the light, and called my name. "Put on your church dress," she said. She had bought a bus ticket for me, just for me. I thought it might be some kind of present, maybe a surprise trip to visit my aunt in Fresno. She told me it was to Los Angeles, that a friend would pick me up at the Greyhound station, and that I should sit by the window, not talk to anyone, and only get off at the final stop. She repeated this about 4 times. She didn't cry, but there was something in her eyes that made me want to throw up. It wasn't sadness, it was relief. She didn't take me to the bus herself. She asked our neighbor to walk me to the terminal, gave me a kiss on the forehead, straightened my collar, stuffed an envelope deep into my backpack, and said, "Call me when you get there." She didn't have a phone. I sat by the window just like she told me to. I watched the world pass by and tried to count the Joshua trees. The seat next to me stayed empty for a while, but after a couple of stops, a man got on who smelled strongly of cigarettes and stale sweat. He sat down and spoke loudly to the driver. "This the one?" The driver looked at me and just nodded. They didn't know I was listening. I pretended to be asleep but kept listening. "It's in the envelope, right?" "Yeah, it's there. Check it when we arrive." That bus felt like it was going to a place that didn't exist. The highway signs started disappearing. The cars became fewer. It was already past midnight when the driver passed by my seat and said with a smile I'll never forget, "Hey, little miss, almost time to deliver the package." I should have felt scared, but I only felt shame. It was like I was a burden, an object, a gift that nobody wanted but was going to be delivered anyway. I looked at my backpack. I knew there was something wrong with that envelope, but my fear of disobeying my mother was stronger than everything else. So I stayed seated, quiet, pretending to sleep again, while the bus turned onto a narrower dirt road. That's where everything got even worse. The dirt road shook the bus, the interior light flickered on and off, and the driver, the same one who had called me a package, was now at the back of the bus talking quietly on his phone. But it wasn't a normal whisper. It was the kind of conversation where someone pretends to be calm, but is confirming everything, like they're afraid of making a mistake. "Yeah, that's right, dark-haired girl, wearing the clothes you described, sitting by the window, she's calm." Then he hung up. That's when I knew, even without understanding everything, that this trip wasn't for me, it was for someone else. I was what was being transported. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was just a child, and my head could only repeat what my mother had said. "Stay seated, don't talk to anyone, get off only at the Lowe's Angels station." But we weren't going to Lowe's Angels. The road started getting narrower. The window outside only showed scrubland. No signs, no cars coming the other way. It was like the world had emptied out, like that bus was going to a place that didn't exist on any map. Up front, the driver received something from the conductor's hands. An envelope. It was mine. I saw it. Even though I was afraid to look, I saw it. The driver looked inside, counted the bills with his thumb, and just said, "That's right." That's right hurt me more than a slap, because I understood that something had been closed, agreed upon, sold. It was like my life had a price and someone had paid for it. But I never found out what was going to happen next because there wasn't time. The bus suddenly sped up, took a curve where there was no curve, and threw itself off the road. That's how it seemed. It threw itself down an embankment. Everything turned into noise, glass, smoke. I don't know how, but I got trapped between two seats. My leg hurt, I tasted blood, but I was alive. People were screaming. The smell of leaking oil was strong. There was a woman who pulled me out, a passenger who had been sitting a few rows behind me. She got me out of there in a panic, picked me up, and carried me to the shoulder of the road. The driver died. The conductor disappeared. Nobody found him. The woman who saved me was the one who took me to the hospital. She explained to the paramedics that I was unaccompanied, that I didn't know my mother's phone number, that no one was waiting for me. I stayed in a children's ward for 2 days. Then they sent me to a group home. My mother never showed up. She became a missing person in the paperwork, They said maybe she had run away or died or gotten involved with the wrong people. I heard adults whispering about her. They said she was troubled, that she had lost custody of another child before me, that she had dangerous friends, but nobody explained anything to me. I grew up in group homes and temporary families until one day, as an adult, I went looking through a box of old documents trying to get paperwork together for a new driver's license. And there, among old certificates, medical records, and a photo of me at about 3 years old, was a letter. A letter from my mother. It was addressed to a man. The envelope was torn, no stamp or date, just the contents. She's obedient, eats little, speaks softly, and doesn't get into anything. She'll help you forget about your ex, keep you company. She's a good girl. It was about me. That's why she dressed me that way. That's why she taught me to smile quietly. That's why she trained me to be invisible and gentle. She wasn't raising me, she was preparing me. That was never a trip, it was a delivery. And to this day, I don't know the name of the man who was supposed to pick me up. I don't know if he found out about the accident. I don't know if he was waiting with a car at some point on that road, or if he gave up after he heard what happened. I never heard from my mother again either. All I know is that crash took me off that bus, but I don't know if it saved me, because there are nights when I think maybe the accident only delayed what was coming. Maybe I'm still the package, just nobody wants to receive me anymore. I've treated patients who pulled out their own hair and then tried to swallow it. I've been called urgently because a 30-year-old man was convinced he had a hidden camera in his left eye. I've had to restrain a teenager who talked to an adult version of herself, as if there were two people sharing the body. In other words, I thought I knew how far the human mind could go. It was a stifling Saturday night, the kind where the air conditioning in the closed ward couldn't keep up. I was on my shift at the psychiatric hospital, one of the most expensive in Los Angeles. I might add, when I received a notification in the internal system, emergency transfer from a partner hospital. A man, 30-something years old, unspecified delirium, refusing medication, no documentation, no reported aggressiveness. But there was an alert: compulsory hospitalization under intensive observation. These cases are usually difficult, but I've dealt with much worse. What caught my attention, however, was what appeared in the file as justification for isolation. Patient says he already knows the doctor from before, claims he will only talk to her, refuses to identify himself, alleges that she knows who he is. That's how it started. I went down to the containment sector and asked to see the monitor camera before entering the room. He was sitting calm. His hands rested on his knees, his back straight, his head slightly tilted forward. He wasn't shaking, wasn't talking to himself, didn't have any of the classic signs I expected. He seemed at peace. At the time, I thought it was just manipulation. I've seen many people do that. The human mind is smart, even when it's collapsing. I entered. He looked at me directly, without any hesitation. And then he said, with a low voice, as if he was recognizing me in an empty restaurant, "You took a long time to accept that it's me." I remember that phrase to this day, but more than the words, the way he said it. He wasn't trying to scare me. He didn't smile or stare aggressively. He spoke like someone who lamented a late reunion, as if he really knew me. I introduced myself, of course, as I always do, and asked him to say his full name to start the chart. He replied, "You know my name, you just don't want to remember." That's where the first crack began. It could have been just delirium, a repeated speech from someone confused, but there was a detail. He used a word that no one else used to refer to me. Annie. Not Dr. Elizabeth, not ma'am, just Annie. A nickname I only heard from my grandfather and that I never mentioned at the hospital. Never. I ignored it, continued with the standard approach. But in the following sessions, he continued with the same calm, without imposing, without raising his voice, just apparently narrating about himself. But the details matched events that were mine. He talked about a blue house in the interior of California, with concrete stairs where I scraped my knee at 8 years old. He talked about a dog that never came back from the woods. He talked about a time when I wore a necklace with a green stone that I lost in 2002. Up to that point, it could be justified. It could have been someone who knew me in the past or who had access to personal files. But no one knew what he told in the third session. He described a certain month of my life when I lived in a small studio in San Francisco. A complicated period that not even my mother knew about properly. He said that the right wall always had water damage, but you preferred to leave it like that so you wouldn't have to talk to the landlord. In the fourth session, he told what broke me inside. We cried together that Sunday. Do you remember when you put your hand on your own belly and said you'd rather no one knew? There was no sound in that room, not even from the cameras. My heart froze. There was no way he could know that. I spent weeks alone, without telling even my father, without writing. I almost erased it from memory like someone who closes a locked closet and throws away the key. And he described the blanket, the color of the socks I wore, and the phrase I said out loud in the dark. If anyone knew that, they wouldn't recognize me anymore. I asked to leave the room. I sat in the hallway with the feeling that my own past had been scanned, reviewed, spied on. I went to the internal system and reviewed his entire history. No official data, no relatives, no contact, no document with photo, just the notation. Identity refused by patient. I decided to interrupt the sessions until I could reorganize my own logic, but then he sent me a note. The following night, the nurse found a folded paper left on my desk. There was no camera showing how it got there. On the paper, written in firm handwriting was, "I just wanted to know if you're still you or if I've already been me too." And right below, "Remember the scar on your left foot. It was when we fell from the swing." My blood froze. The scar, it's really there, almost imperceptible. But what destroyed me was that I never fell from a swing with anyone, or at least I thought I hadn't. The following night, he wasn't found in the ward, no exit record. No security call, just the made bed and the lab coat folded on the mattress. My lab coat with my name embroidered and a last note in the pocket. "You need to remember before I forget." When I got to the car, I looked in the rearview mirror while starting the engine, and there, at the base of my left foot, was a thin, fresh scratch, exactly where the scar is. I slept in the car that night. I was afraid to go home, afraid to look at my own old albums, afraid to open the drawers where I keep my college diaries, afraid to find more signs that he or I was right. I tried to rationalize, as I always did. I thought about some security failure, possible data leak, unauthorized access. But I never put my personal life in the hospital systems. I'm methodical. I have control over my own story, or I thought I did. The next day, I filed a formal request for leave. I used a technical argument, need to review my clinical performance with patients with identity distortion. It was accepted immediately. After all, it's years of service without any incident. But what I didn't write in the request was the real reason for the leave. I was no longer confident that what happened was his delirium. I started doing what I always criticized in patients in crisis, looking for signs in daily life, trying to make sense of what was just life. But the details started appearing in places where they shouldn't. The first thing was the letter, an envelope left inside my purse, sealed, no sender, nothing. Inside it, a single sheet with an excerpt from my undergraduate thesis, a paragraph that I myself deleted from the final text, never published, never shared. The content talked about reversible identity in dissociative disorders. The final sentence on the sheet was, "Truth can manifest as a symptom and be ignored for seeming like delirium." I couldn't eat that day. I went home, lay on the couch, and left the television on just to have some sound. But even so, in the middle of the night, I woke up with a memory. It was a rope sound, swing rope. I went to the window in the dark without turning on anything. The building's garden was empty, but the swing rope was swaying by itself. No, I'm not saying it was his spirit or anything like that. I know the wind can do that, but it wasn't windy. That left me trembling. I went back inside and sat on the bathroom floor. I felt a heat rising through my body, as if the past was about to explode from within. I'm not a spiritual person. I don't believe in reincarnation. But at that moment, the only thing I thought was, what if he is? A part of me, a part I expelled, that I denied, that survived somehow. In the following days, my routine became a game of denial. I left the house, pretended everything was normal, but avoided mirrors. I avoided looking at myself too long, avoided seeing my own eyes, because deep down I thought it might not be just me there. Until exactly 2 weeks after his disappearance, I received a package at the private office I maintained in downtown Los Angeles. The secretary handed it to me, saying it was from a regular delivery person. Nothing strange. I opened it. It was an old notebook, yellowed with a worn cover, a diary, my diary. But it wasn't mine, not that one. The handwriting was similar to mine, but it wasn't. The dates matched periods of my life, but the point of view of the texts was from someone observing me live. Today, she decided to tell everything to no one. Today, she buried another piece of herself in other people's heads. She thinks she was forgotten, but I'm the one who keeps watch. She thinks she was unique, but I also saw myself that day. She's starting to remember. I need to go before she sees me completely. I closed the notebook with such force that my nails hurt the palm of my hand. On the last page there was a photograph. It was a photo of me sitting on a swing. Next to me, a blurred child, the image shaky, distorted. But you could see it was someone beside me, and a detail that no one would notice. But I would, on my left foot, the same scratch, exactly like the one that appeared in the car mirror. I wanted to destroy it, but I couldn't. I kept it, hid it, never told anyone, not even colleagues, not even a therapist, until today, because after that I abandoned psychiatry altogether. I could no longer trust my ability to diagnose. I could no longer look at a patient's face and believe I knew who they were. Because what if someone there knew too much about me? What if he came back, or worse, what if he's still with me? Sometimes I wake up with phrases in my head that aren't mine, words I don't use. sensations I never lived, but that appear as memories, as if someone was remembering me from inside. The last phrase he said before disappearing kept echoing when the camera recorded the sound of the night, a snippet captured by mistake in a surveillance audio. I heard it and never forgot again. He said, "She forgot that we were the same body, but I still remember." And I started remembering too. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.